Chapter 15 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 15. Great strength and safety with heaviest charges. Absolute immunity from all risk of blowing open. The combination of a perfect trigger action with a perfect cocking action. Ted Haviland was standing outside the window of a gunsmith's shop in the King's Road, Chelsea, reading the enticing legends in which Mr. Webley sets forth the superiority of his wares above those of all other makers. It was the second day after he had got Audrey's letter. In his least hopeful moods he had never expected that blow, and when it fell as a bolt from the blue, he was stunned and could not realize that he was struck. He imagined all kinds of explanations to account for Audrey's conduct. It was a misunderstanding, a sudden freak. There was some mystery waiting to be solved. Someone, his cousin Nettie probably, had spread some story about him which had reached Audrey. The scandal already spread in the family would have been enough. She could hardly have identified its loudly dressed heroine as herself. It only remained for him to clear his character. Anything rather than believe in what all healthy youth revolts against, the irrevocable, the end. He had tried 3 times to see Audrey, and she was not at home, though the third time he had seen her go into the house not 2 minutes before. That instant he had turned away with a stinging mist in his eyes and the blood surging in his brain. His thoughts now leaped to the end as blindly as they had shrunk from it before. He had no definite idea of shooting himself when he turned into the King's Road. His one object was to go in any direction rather than home. But the shop window, with its stacks of rifles and cards displaying Mark I revolvers, arranged on them like the spokes of a wheel, caught his attention. He was possessed with the desire to have a revolver of his own, no matter for what purpose. He had just chosen a Mark I, and was going into the shop to buy it, when he heard his name called in a loud, hearty voice. "Ted, you bounder, stop!" And his arm was pulled with a grip that drew him backward from the doorstep. "Hardy!" He knew the voice, but it was hard to recognize the man. A thick black beard, a face that might have been tanned with bark, trousers tucked into high boots and tightened with a belt like a horse girth, an old Norfolk jacket stained with travel and the chase, a canvas shirt laced with a red cord and tassels, and a plate-like hat of grey felt flapping about his ears, made Hardy look something like a cowboy or a bandit. So singular was the apparition that had plucked Ted back from the abyss, that the Furies and the infernal phantoms vanished into smoke before it. It brought with it a breath of Atlantic seas and of winds from the far west. "You young rascal, so it's you, is it? I didn't know you from Satan, till I saw you turn round, after flattening your nose against what's-his-name's plate glass. I wish I were in your shoes." "Do you?" said Ted with a grimace. Why?" "Because your whole expression suggests partridges." "Does it? As it happens, I was thinking about a revolver." "Potting burglars, eh? About all the sport you poor devils of cockneys will get on the first." "Look here, Hardy, this is uncanny. Where did you spring from?" "Straight from Euston this afternoon. From Queenstown yesterday morning. Before that from the other side of the Rockies." "That accounts for your amazing get-up." "Yes, and by Jove! After a year in a log hut on the wrong side of a precipice, you're glad to get your feet on London pavement and smell London smells again. And look there, Ted! There isn't a lovelier sight on God's earth than a well-dressed Englishwoman. Where are we going? How about that revolver?" Ted had forgotten all about it. Hardy's sane, open-air spirits had infected him so far that he had let himself be dragged at a rapid pace up the King's Road, where their progress attracted considerable attention. As Hardy strode on with his long swinging legs, he appeared to be scattering the crowd before him. "Never mind the thing now, it'll keep. How that girl stares! Does she take us for banditti?" "Not you, you puppy, in that coat and topper. No mistaking you for anything but what you are, the sickly product of an effete civilization. Don't be frightened. You haven't gone off in the least. You're a little pale, but prettier than you were, if anything." "I say, you ought to be in the bosom of your family." "I haven't got a family." "Well, what brings you here, of all places in the world?" "My cousin Audrey Craven." There was no reserve about Hardy. At the name, so unexpectedly spoken, the underworld opened again for Ted with all its furies. They walked on for some minutes in silence, then Hardy began again. "I called to see her. Of course she was out. Hard lines, wasn't it?" Ted forced himself to speak. "Oh yes, beastly hard." "You must have met her lately. How is she looking?" "Oh, remarkably cheerful when I last saw her." "When was that?" Hardy asked, a little anxiously. "The day before yesterday." "Ah! She'd got my telegram then." Ted bit his lip. They were too much absorbed, he in his misery and Hardy in his joy, for either to be conscious of the other's feeling. "Old boy," said Hardy, as they turned out of the King's Road, "what have you got to do?" "Nothing." "Then come and help me to hunt up some diggings. How about Devon Street?" "I don't know, but I suppose we can look," said Ted, dismally. Hardy's spirits were beginning to pall on him. "I may as well go and look up Katherine while I'm about it. Dear old Sis, I suppose she'll be out too." "Not she. She's too busy for that." "Not too busy to see her old playfellow, you bet your boots." He was so glad to see everybody again that he was sure everybody must be glad to see him. In his rapture at being in London, the place he loathed and execrated a year ago, he could have embraced the stranger in the street. Those miles of pavement, those towering walls that seemed to make streets of the sky as he looked up, all that world of brick and mortar was Audrey's world, the ground for her feet, the scene of all her doings. The women that went by wore the fashions she would be wearing now. At any moment she herself might turn out of some shop door, round some corner. A faint hope that he might find her with Katherine had led him to Devon Street. But Ted's, not Audrey's, were the first hands that touched his, and it was not Audrey, but his little half sister, that gave Hardy his first welcome home. "Well, Sis?" "Vincent! Is it you?" There was nothing in the words but the glad courtesy of the woman who had been his playfellow in the days when he was a boy and she a tomboy, but they went to Hardy's heart and dried up his speech. They were the first kind words he had heard since he left England. Katherine put away her work and made him sit in the one comfortable chair the studio afforded. Mrs. Rogers was sent for cakes and cream at a moment's notice, and the resources of the tiny household were taxed to their utmost to do honour to the returned emigrant. Even Ted forgot his gloom for the time being, and took his part in these hospitable rites. Then came the question of Hardy's lodgings. Mrs. Rogers was consulted, and being unable to name any landlady of greater respectability than herself, and her ground floor happening to be to let, the rarest thing in the world for her, she suggested that the gentleman should try it for a week or two, till he could suit himself elsewhere. "But though I say it as shouldn't, when a gentleman comes to me, sir, he wants to stay. My last gentleman, he'd a stayed with me till he was took away in his coffin if I'd a kept him. But Lord bless you, my dear, he was that particular I couldn't do with his fads, not at fancy prices. I couldn't. I had to tell him to go, for Mussy's sake, or he'd get his own French cook and his own butler to black his half dozen pair of boots all at once for him." This was the recognised fiction by which Mrs. Rogers accounted for the departure of any of her lodgers. Lest it should seem to speak badly for her willingness and for the quality of the attendance at No. 12, she invariably added, "Not but what I'd work my head off to please any gentleman that is a gentleman, and when you've eaten one of my dinners, sir, you won't want nobody else to cook and do for you no more." And though Ted had pointed out to her the sinister ambiguity of this formula, she had never invented any other. The ground floor was seen, and after Mrs. Rogers on her part had stipulated for cold lunches 3 days in the week, and not more than one bath in the one day, and after Katherine on Hardy's part had suggested sundry innovations, involving the condemnation of all the pictures and ornaments she could lay her hands on, a piece of sacrilege which Mrs. Rogers regarded more in sorrow than in anger, as indicating a pitiable aberration of intellect, the rooms were taken from that date. Was it chance or necessity or providence that caused Ted and Hardy to meet at the parting of the ways, that waked Ted from the dream of self destruction, and lodged Hardy under the same roof with Katherine Haviland? His arrangements completed, Hardy hurried off again to Chelsea. Audrey, he thought, had expected him by a later train, and would be back by 6 o'clock waiting for him. This time the footman met him with a little note from his mistress. Audrey had never dreamed that Vincent could get up to town so quickly. She was so sorry she had missed him, especially as she had had to go to bed with a feverish cold and a splitting headache. She would be delighted to see him if he could call to morrow afternoon between 3 and 4, and she was always very affectionately his. He was bitterly disappointed, but his disappointment was nothing to his trouble about Audrey's illness. Feverish colds contracted in August often prove fatal. But he was not utterly cast down. There was still to morrow. He went back to Devon Street slowly, for he felt tired, out of all proportion to his muscular exertions that day. During the evening, which he spent in the Haviland studio, his depression gave way before the prospect of seeing Audrey to morrow. He looked at Katherine's pictures, gave her a great deal of advice, and expressed the utmost astonishment at the progress she had made. He considered "The Witch of Atlas" particularly fine. "It was painted 4 years ago, and as a matter of fact I haven't made a bit of progress since. But never mind, you're quite right. It isn't half bad." She bent over her picture lovingly, brushed away the dust from the canvas, and turned it resolutely with its face to the wall. She had not looked at it since the day of renunciation. Her work led Hardy on to talk of his, and he grew eloquent about the book "Sport West of the Rockies," which, as he had once told Audrey, was to make posterity sit up. He had the manuscript downstairs in his bag. Some day he would read them a chapter or two. It would give them some idea of wild virgin nature, of what a sportsman's life really was, the best life perhaps, take it all round, to be lived on this earth. It was to be the pioneer book of its subject. Hardy was always at his ease with Ted and Katherine. Self restraint was superfluous in their company. They knew him too well, and liked him in spite of their knowledge. They were used to his tempestuous bursts of narrative, and would laugh frankly in his face, while he joined in the laugh with the greatest enjoyment. With him, ornamental story telling was an amusing game, in which, if you were clever enough to catch him lying, you had won and he had lost, that was all. To night he lay back in his chair and expanded gloriously. He told tales of perilous adventure by flood and field, by mountain and forest, of the wild chase of moose and wapiti among the snows of the Rockies, of the fierce delight of single handed combat with grizzly bears, the deadliest of their kind, of how he, Hardy, had been rolled down a canyon, locked in the embrace of a furry fiend that he had stabbed in the throat 1 second before the fatal hug. He told of the melting of the snows in forest rivers, of the flood that swept away the lonely traveller's encampment, and bore him, astride on a log of driftwood, 5 miles amid wrack and boulders on its whirling current; of deliverance through a pious Indian in his canoe, which he entered as by a miracle in midstream, and without upsetting any of the three. He told of long wanderings in the twilight solitudes of Canadian forests, of dangers from wolves and the wild coyotes, half dog, half wolf, heard nightly howling round the Indian camp fires, and from the intangible malice of the skunk, a beautiful but dreadful power, to be propitiated with bated breath and muffled footstep. He told too of the chipmunks with their sharp twittering bark, and he contrived to invest even these tiny creatures with an atmosphere of terror; for it is well known that their temper is atrocious, and that a colony of them will set upon the unfortunate traveller who happens to offend one, and leave nothing of him but his bones and the indigestible portions of his clothing. And over all he cast the glamour of his fancy, as if it had been the red light of the prairie sunsets. In it he appeared transfigured, a half mythical personage, heroic if not indeed divine. The whole of it had appeared word for word in the pages of the Pioneer book. "Ah, Sis," he observed complacently at the end of it, "that's all copy for Sport West of the Rockies. When that comes out you'll soon see me at the top of the tree. Why aren't you an artist in words? Why don't you use the pen instead of the brush?" He implied that if her ambition had been literary, he would have raised her to a position just below him on the highest pinnacle of earthly fame. Then he passed, by a gentle transition, to another subject. "By the by, have you two seen much of my cousin Audrey?" This second utterance of the name was too much for Ted's overstrained nerves. He got up, stifled a yawn, and held out his hand to Hardy. "I say, do you mind if I go to bed now? I can't for the life of me keep awake." "Good night, old fellow. I'm afraid I've sent you to sleep with my yarns." "Not a bit. We'll have some more to morrow." "To morrow?" "What's the matter with the boy, Kathy? He looks seedy." "Oh, nothing. He's not overstrong perhaps, but he's all right." "What's he doing with himself here?" "Painting. Oh, Vincent, I should like you to see some of his things, now he's gone." All her pride in her brother was roused,
perhaps by Vincent's boasting. She lifted the white linen cloth that covered one of Ted's easels and revealed the portrait of Audrey. She had not guessed the truth. If she had, she would not have looked at Vincent just then. The effect she had produced was unmistakable. The blood rose to his face in a wave that died suddenly away, leaving a yellowish pallor under its sunburn. "How beautiful!" he said softly, more to himself than Katherine. He gazed at the portrait as if his eyes would never be satisfied with seeing. The pathos in his face gave it a sort of spirituality, and Katherine noticed his hand trembling as he helped her to cover the picture again. "It's like her, as only genius could make it." Only genius? Did he think that only genius had wrought that work of transfiguration, in which Katherine found it hard to see any likeness to the woman as she knew her now? She had read the secret of Vincent's hope. Ought she to let him believe a lie? Did not she, Ted's sister, of all people, owe him the truth? No. Vincent's eyes looked as if they wanted sleep before everything. Sufficient unto the night is the evil thereof. And perhaps, after all, she had been mistaken. Hardy held out his hand, said a short good night, and was gone before she could say more. There flashed back on her the memory of Audrey's first visit to her. She recalled her little self conscious air of possession in speaking of her cousin. She was morally certain that Audrey had treated Vincent as she had treated Ted. "Beware of the woman who kisses you on both cheeks. It's too much for friendship and too little for love." Hardy went out of doors, turned on to the Embankment, and so on to Chelsea for the third time that day. He wanted to assure himself of Audrey's nearness by one more sight of the brown brick shrine that held her. The house stood as he had seen it once before, asleep in the yellow gaslight, shut in from the road by the trees, screened from the lamps on the Embankment by the storm shutters folded over its windows, guarding its secrets well, all but two windows on the second floor, which were open to the night. That was Audrey's room, he knew. Little fool! Ill with a feverish cold, and sleeping with open windows! For about half an hour he walked up and down on the Embankment opposite, like a sentry on duty, his long shadow blackening and fading as he passed from light to light. When he got back to his rooms he felt a sensation that had sometimes come upon him after a long day's hunting, a feeling of deadly fatigue and stifling emptiness, as if the rest of his body were drained of the blood that choked his heart. He opened his travelling bag, took out a large silver flask, looked at it, sighed, shuddered slightly, poured about 2 tablespoonfuls of brandy down his throat, and then, with a gesture of indescribable disgust, emptied the remainder out of the window into the yard below. He undressed and got into bed quickly, turned over on his right side for greater ease, and was soon asleep and dreaming of tomorrow. End of chapter 15. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 16 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 16. There was no sleep for Ted that night. Towards morning he fell into a doze, broken by unpleasant dreams, and woke with a confused consciousness of trouble. It had been connected in his dreams with Hardy's return, and once awake, the knowledge that he was in the same house with him was insupportable. Not that he had yet guessed how Vincent stood to Audrey; he had simply a nervous dread of hearing him talk about her. The casual utterance of her name went through him like a sword, and in his present mood Vincent's boisterous spirit disturbed and irritated him. More to get away from him than with any definite idea of work, he spent his morning at the National Gallery, touching up the copy of the Botticelli Madonna, which Katherine had begun long ago for Audrey. He had set to work almost mechanically, with the sense that whatever he did at the present moment was only provisional, only a staving off of the intolerable future. But soon the technical difficulties of his task absorbed him, and he became interested in spite of himself. He was so passive to the spiritual influences of line and colour that perhaps the beauty of the grey eyed girl Madonna may have given him something of its own tranquillity. Unfortunately the good effects of his morning's industry were undone when he got home, by finding Hardy alone in the studio, sitting before Audrey's portrait. He had dragged the easel to the light, and had been studying the canvas for some minutes before Ted came in. The boy stifled an angry exclamation. "Ted," said Hardy, "what do you want for this picture?" "I don't want anything for it." "Nonsense! Every good picture has its price." "This one hasn't, anyway. Look here, and don't be a young fool. This is the best thing you've done in your life, or ever will do. I'm in rather low water at present, but wait till I've heard from my British Columbian agent, or better still, wait till the Pioneer book comes out, and I'll give you 100 for it, honour bright, if you'll let me have it at once." "I can't let you have it at once, and I won't let you have it at all." "The deuce you won't. Come, fix your own price." "I'm not a swindling dealer, and I'm not a liar, though you mightn't think it. I told you I wasn't going to let you have it at any price." "H'm. Do you mind telling me one thing? Are you going to sell it to any one else?" "I'm not going to sell it to any one. I'm going to keep it myself." They looked at each other with steady eyes, each understanding and each defying the other's thought. Hardy's face was the first to soften. He put his hand on Ted's shoulders. "All right, old boy. We've hit each other hard this time. The least we can do is to hold our tongues about it," and he left him. Hardy spoke with the magnanimity of imperfect comprehension. He had been defeated in his purpose of buying Audrey's portrait, but however great his discomfiture, he, being the successful lover, could afford a little pity for Ted as the victim of a hopeless passion. To Ted, on the other hand, the revelation of Hardy's feelings threw light on Audrey's conduct. It accounted for everything that was most inexplicable in it. It must have been the news of Hardy's return that made her break off her engagement so suddenly. His instinct told him that she had probably given her word to her cousin before he left England. Jealousy suggested that she had cared for him all the time. He tried to reason it out, but stopped short of the obvious conclusion that, if these things were altogether as he supposed, her engagement to himself must have been merely an amusement hit upon by Audrey to fill up a dull interval. He preferred to regard it as a mystery. And now all reasoning gave way before the desire to see her again, and know the truth from herself once for all. To Audrey, as the fountain of truth, he accordingly went, choosing a time between 2:30 and 3, when she was most likely to be in. As he reached her door, it was being held open for her to go out, and she was standing in the outer hall buttoning her gloves. She drew back when she saw Ted, but escape was impossible. He saw the movement and the flash of her little white teeth as she bit her lip with annoyance. She came forward smiling. "Oh, is it you, Ted? As you see, I'm just going out." "You will see me before you go?" "I can't possibly. I've got to go and call on an uncle and aunt at the Hotel Metropole." "I'm very sorry, but I won't keep you more than 10 minutes." "I can't spare 10 minutes. I'm late as it is, and I have to be back by 3:30. I've got an appointment." "You've not time to get there and back. You'd better put it off." "I can't, Ted. They're only up from Friday till Monday. Dean Craven has to preach at the Abbey to morrow. Come again." "I can't come again." "Well, then," she hesitated, "you may walk part of the way with me." He went with her down the short flagged path that led to the gate. Once out of the servant's hearing, he stopped and looked firmly in her face. "I must see you now, and it had better be in the house. I've only one question to ask you. 5 minutes will be enough for that. At least it won't be my fault if it isn't." She had laid her hand on the gate, which Ted held shut, and her mouth was obstinately set. Something in his voice conquered her self will. She turned and led the way to the house. "You had better come into the morning room." He followed her. She closed the door, and they stood facing each other a moment without speaking. "Well, Ted?" Her voice went to his heart with its piercing sweetness. "Audrey, why did you write that letter?" "Because it was easier to write what I did than to say it." "Do you want to hold me to my word?" "No, I want to know your reasons for breaking it. You haven't given me any yet." "I did, Ted. I told you it had all been a mistake, yours and mine." "Speak for yourself. Where was my mistake?" "The mistake was in our ever getting engaged at all, in our thinking that we cared for each other." "I cared enough for you, didn't I?" "No, you didn't. You only thought you did. Katherine told me—" "What did Katherine tell you?" "That you hadn't any feelings, that you really cared for nothing but your painting, that you'd only a rudimentary heart." "Really? That is interesting. When did she tell you that?" "The very day we were engaged." "And you believed her?" "Not then. I did afterwards." "How long afterwards? The other day?" "Yes, I think so." "I see. When you wanted to believe it, not before." She was trembling, but she gathered together all her feeble forces for the defence. "No, no. Don't you remember? At the very first, the day of our engagement, we were both so miserable at the idea of your going away. We did it all so recklessly, before either of us thought. You see, Ted, you were so very young." "It's a pity that didn't strike you before." It did, but I wouldn't think of it. I blinded myself. The fact is, we were both as mad as hatters. You know people can't get married in that state. We should have had to wait for a lucid interval." Ted recognized the miserable pleasantry. It was what he had said to her himself a day or two after their engagement. The phrase had amused Audrey at the time, and lodged in her memory. She borrowed it now in her hour of need, and laughed, unconscious of her plagiarism. "I understand perfectly. You want to get rid of me as a proof of your own sanity. Is that it?" She looked up in the utmost surprise. "Not to get rid of you, Ted. Of course not. I shall still keep you as my best friend." "Thanks. You had better not try to do that. I'm told I've no talent for friendship." "Then I suppose after this you'd rather I cut you if we meet?" "You can please yourself about that." "You may be sure I shall. Oh, Ted, I didn't expect that from you. But it's quite right. Hit hard. I can't defend myself." "Please don't attempt it. There's no occasion to. Only tell me one thing." "Well?" She sat down as if wearied with this unnecessary trifling. He paused. "It's evident that you don't care about me. Do you care for any one else?" "You've no right to ask me that." "Haven't I? I thought I had. And if you'll only think a minute you'll agree with me." She put her head on one side as if gravely considering the question. "No, you've no right to ask me that." "Let me put it differently. Since your feelings are sacred, you needn't tell me anything about them. Were you engaged to Hardy before you knew me?" "That question is even more impertinent than the last." "I beg your pardon, then. Don't answer it, if you don't like to." He turned away. "Don't go yet, Ted. I haven't done. Listen, I was thoughtless, I was mistaken. Audrey was anxious to escape the imputation of a big fault by the graceful confession of a little one. But I'm not as bad as you think me. You think I cared for Vincent. I didn't. I never cared a straw about him. Never. You were the first." "Was I? Not the last, though, it seems." "Perhaps not. But I deceived myself before I deceived you." "Well, you took me in completely, if it's any satisfaction to you. Never mind, Audrey, you've done your best to remedy that now." He had turned, and his hand was on the door to go, when he heard her calling him back softly. "Ted." She had followed him to the door. He felt the touch of her little gloved hand on his coat sleeve. Under the black meshes of her veil he saw her eyes shining with tears that could not fall. He hesitated. "Forgive me," she whispered. "Not till you have answered my question." "Which question, Ted?" "The impertinent one." "About Vincent?" "Yes." Her eyes had been fixed on the ground, now they glanced up quickly. "Did Vincent tell you I was engaged to him?" "No." Her eyelids drooped again; then, urged to desperation by her own cowardice, she raised them and looked in his face to answer. And as she looked she saw for the first time how changed it was. Its bloom was gone, the lines were set and hard. Ted looked years older than his age. "Don't believe him if he ever says so. I am not engaged to him, and I never was." "Thanks. That was all I wanted to know." He turned on his heel and left her. He knew that she had lied. He left her in a state of vague consternation. She had been prepared for an outburst of feeling on Ted's part, in which case she would have remained mistress of the field without loss of dignity. As it had happened, the victory was certainly not with her. This was contrary to all her expectations. She had looked for protestations, emotions, in short, a scene, but not for cold, dispassionate cross examination. It was so unlike Ted Ted, who was always giving himself away. It was more the sort of thing she could have fancied Wyndham saying under the same circumstances. She had seen something of this impersonal manner once or twice before, in those rare moments when they had discussed some picture, or Ted had talked to her about his work or Katherine's. It had annoyed her then. She thought it showed a want of enthusiasm. Now the boy's heartless self possession amazed and overpowered her. Audrey was incapable of imagining what she had not seen, and she had never got to the bottom of the Haviland character, never divined its gravity under the mask of frivolity, never proved its will nor reckoned with its pride. 3 days ago she would have laughed at the idea of referring any moral question to Ted's judgment, for she had taken no pains to hide her faults from him. She had been selfish, reckless, vain, capricious, by turns and altogether, and it had made no difference then. Now she felt that he had condemned her. To be sure, she had told him a lie, but what was that in the catalogue of her offences? It was everything. He could have forgiven anything but that. End of chapter 16. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Chapter 17 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 17. But Ted's notion of morality was a question Audrey had no time to go into. A violent ring at the front door bell recalled her to herself, and made her glance at the clock. It was 3:15. She had wasted half an hour in fruitless discussion with Ted, and it left her ill prepared for the stormy interview to follow. Her nerve gave way before the prospect of that hour with Hardy. She might have escaped it if it had not been for Ted, for she had meant to call early on her uncle and aunt and bring them back with her to Chelsea, so that it would be impossible for Vincent to see her alone. Ted's coming had made that scheme useless. She listened. Yes, it was Vincent. She had heard his voice in the hall. "I told him between 3 and 4. Anybody else would have known that meant 4:30." She spent 10 minutes after Hardy was announced gathering herself together to meet him. She would have thought of sending for Miss Craven, an old device of hers when she wanted to avoid explanations, but Miss Craven was away. Her only hope was in some casual caller. Meanwhile Hardy was striding up and down the drawing room, waiting impatiently for Audrey. He was a little hurt at being shown into an empty room. He had expected to find the small thing sitting there to welcome him. That 10 minutes was the longest he had ever spent. It was the meeting point in time for 2 eternities. As his thought leaped forward to the future, it was thrown back upon the past. Then, as he gazed about him half mechanically, he was aware that his eyes were looking for the things they had been used to and could not find them. Everything was changed in that room he had run in and out of as a boy. The familiar furniture, the signs and tokens of Audrey's daily presence, the old fashioned knick-knacks which had delighted her mother's heart, all were gone. His aunt's portrait was no longer there. In its place hung the photogravure of the Madonna di San Sisto. Instead of the cosy corner where he had lain at Audrey's feet, his last night in England, there stood a polished rosewood secretary, thrown open, showing its empty pigeonholes. Everywhere he looked it was the same, there were new things all around him. If he could have read their secret, he would have seen that that room was the picture of Audrey's soul. The persons who had by turns taken possession of it had left there each one the traces of his power. If you could have cut a vertical section through Audrey's soul, you would have found it built up in successive layers of soul. When you had dug through Wyndham, you came to Ted. When you had got through Ted, you came upon Hardy, the oldest formation of all. The room was instructive as a museum filled with the records of these changes. But the specimens were badly arranged, recent deposits lying side by side with relics of an earlier period. Thus the floor was covered with the bearskin given by Hardy and the Persian rugs laid down during the Art Age. The rosewood secretary and a little revolving bookcase by Audrey's chair marked the change wrought by Wyndham. They were part of modern history and the memory of man. Hardy, in the midst of these curiosities of natural science, was like a lay visitor without a guide. He admired, he wondered, he recognized an object here and there, but of what it all meant he had not the ghost of an idea. He left off wondering and waited, listening for the feet that used to fall so lightly on the stairs. At last the door opened softly, and Audrey stood before him, but she stood still, looking at him as if uncertain whether to go or stay. "Audrey!" His face lit up with joy, his heart bounded. "How do you do, Vincent?" He held out his arms, and she came to him slowly without a word. She let him hold her for an instant, closing her eyes to hide the fear in them, let him lift her veil and kiss her cheeks and mouth. Then she turned her face away, put out her hands against his chest,
and pushed him from her. "Audrey, what have I done?" "Oh, I don't know, I don't know." She walked away to the looking glass over the chimney piece and took off her gloves and veil. She wanted to gain time. Hardy followed her to the opposite side of the fireplace. "Whatever possessed you, Vincent, to grow that horrid beard?" He had forgotten the change in his personal appearance. He looked in the glass and was startled by his own reflection. Owing to the agony of the shock she had given him, his face was still grey and drawn. The poor fellow tried to smile, and that made matters worse. "I dare say it was a nasty shock. Did it make you feel as if I was somebody else?" "Oh no, it has not altered you much. It's not that. But I hate beards, as you know." There was silence. Hardy was struggling with the old stifling sensation in his heart. Emotion was bad for him. "Is this all you've got to say to me, after being a year away?" She looked at him, shook her head, and played with the ornaments on the mantel board. "Why can't you speak to me? Has anything happened? Is anybody dead?" "No, but I wish I was." "Why do you say that?" "Because—" She was trying to wring the neck off a little china image now. "Oh, Vincent, don't think me very unkind, but I'd rather, another time, you didn't show your cousinly affection quite in that way, that's all." He covered his eyes with one hand to shut out the sight of Audrey. "No, that's not all, I see. There's something else behind that. There must be. Has anything happened?" She bowed her head and sighed, a long shivering sigh. The china image slipped through her fingers and was broken to bits on the hearthstone. "Audrey, what is it?" He took her by the wrists and drew her gently to him. As he touched her he saw her face whiten and her eyes dilate. "Do you remember last year when you said you loved me, when you promised to be my wife? Do you remember how you said good bye to me then? Now you won't speak to me. What have you been doing to make you hate me? Or what stupid ideas have you got into your head about me?" "Nothing, nothing. Only I want you to understand that what you said just now is out of the question. It can't be." "Why not? You promised, so it could be once. Why not now?" "Because I never really promised, you know." "You never promised? You little liar! You may want to break your promise, but you can hardly say you didn't make it." "I never made it, not of my own free will. You took advantage of me, you forced me into it. You teased me till I said I cared for you, and I didn't." "So then, you told me a lie. You wrote lie after lie to me in your letters for a year?" She writhed away from him, but he still held her by the wrists, face to face with him, the length of their arms apart. "Let me go, Vincent. You've no right to hold me in this way. You're hurting my arm." Unconsciously his grasp had tightened, till the diamond mounted on one of her thread like bracelets was pressed into her flesh and made it bleed. "See there!" He let her go. She sat down and put her pocket handkerchief to her wrist. "If you tell lies, Audrey, what am I to believe? What you said then, or what you say now?" "I'm telling the truth now, because I don't want this wretched misunderstanding to go any further." "Can't you speak plainly? Do you mean this, that you don't love me?" "Yes, it's true. I don't love you. I can't. At least, not like that." "I can't believe it. It's impossible. As long as I can remember, whatever you said or did, you made me think you loved me. You said last year you'd be my wife, but that's nothing. Long before that you let me live on the hope of it, year after year. It's inconceivable that you could have done these things if you didn't care for me. Even you couldn't be such an unfeeling little fiend." "No, no, you worked on my feelings. You wouldn't let me have any will of my own. And now you want me to marry you whether I like it or not. Whatever happens, I can't do that, Vincent." "Why not?" "Must I tell you?" "Isn't that the very least you can do?" "Well, you know, Vincent, you've been very wild. You've told me so yourself 1,000 times." "Is it that? You knew that long ago." "I never realized it till now. Now I know that I can only really love some one strong and good, whose goodness would help me and make me good too." Audrey's infantile irony made Hardy laugh. That laugh frightened her. "Do you think I don't know that?" he said. "What do you suppose I went out of England for? It wasn't to shoot, or to farm either. It was to get away out of the reach of temptation, to live in a pure air, and make myself pure for your sake. Do you know, Audrey, I was out there without a soul to speak to. A year, one horrible long year, fighting the devil, waiting till I could come back and tell you that I was fit to love you. God knows I'm not all I ought to be. Who is? At least I'm not ashamed now to ask you to be my wife. Will you never forget the past?" She had hesitated before, but now Hardy's humility put her in the position of the superior, and his piteous confession gave her the words she wanted. "No, it's no use. Once for all, I do not love you, and if I did I could not marry any man who had led the life you have." "Very well. Remember, Audrey, if I wasn't good enough for you, I was good enough as men go. Now I'll go to the devil, and give my whole mind to it. But I've a great deal to say to you before I go. You object to my life. Good or bad, it's your own work. It's women like you who make men like me. You knew my weakness and played on it. You could have helped me if you'd only given me up honestly at first, as another woman would have done, but you didn't want to do that. I'd have left England long before if you'd let me go. You knew it, and you kept me here, though you saw me going to the bad. Oh, you were an artist in your own line. You knew the effect of every word, every touch, every movement of yours, and you went out of your way to make goodness impossible for me. God knows why, but you liked to see me longing for what you never meant to give me. And because I didn't come out of that ordeal quite clean, you talk to me about my life and tell me you are too good and pure to marry me. Are you really so very much better than I am, after all?" She sat still at first, with her eyes half closed, afraid to look up, afraid to move or speak, waiting for something to happen, for some one to come and stop Vincent. But the scourging voice went on with a relentless brutality, laying bare the secret places of her soul, its unconscious hypocrisy, its vanity, its latent capacity for evil. She answered the closing question with an inarticulate sound like a sob. It might have softened him if he had not been deaf to everything but his own passion. "Don't suppose I flatter myself I'm the only victim. How about that young fool Ted Haviland?" She sprang to her feet. Fear that had made her lie to Ted made her tell the truth to Hardy. That fear was deep rooted. It dated from the days when they were children and Vincent had the mastery in all their play. "Oh, Vincent, promise me you won't do anything to Ted. It's all true about our engagement, but it was more my fault than his." "I can't believe that, Audrey. I'm very far from blaming him. I've no doubt you treated him as you did me." He sat down exhausted. Audrey, seeing the change of position, not the sudden collapse that prompted it, was in despair. "Won't you leave me alone now, Vincent? Haven't you said enough?" "Not yet. Let me think a bit." He leaned back and closed his eyes. He had so much to say, and now he had no words to say it with. Audrey looked at the clock. It was 4:30. Would he begin again? She almost wished he would. It would be better than this silence, better than that frowning forehead with the terrible accusing thoughts behind it. Would no one come? Would he never go? Hardy had found words and was beginning to rouse himself, when in answer to her prayer the door was thrown open. Her deliverance had come in the shape of Langley Wyndham. Hardy's eyes followed her. A moment before she had sat white and trembling, shrunk up into herself before the storm of his accusation. Now for that instant her face became beautiful as he had never seen it before. There was something dramatic in her movement as she rose and went forward to meet Wyndham. There was no mistaking her manner and the tremor of her voice as she spoke to him. Hardy knew his rival before he saw him. "My cousin, Mr. Hardy, Mr. Langley Wyndham." The men looked at each other and bowed stiffly. Wyndham wondered. The scene they had just gone through had left its mark on Hardy's face and Audrey's. The student of human nature congratulated himself on the inspiration which had prompted him to call at this crisis. The cousin suggested interesting complications in his heroine's life. Judging by the set of his lower jaw, she must have had a bad quarter of an hour with him. He would have to reconstruct that drama from the fragments preserved. When Wyndham sat down, Hardy sat down too. He suspected Audrey of having invited this man in order to get rid of himself. She wanted him to go. A savage jealousy made him determined to stay and spoil her pleasure. But Audrey, with Wyndham beside her, had recovered her presence of mind. Unable to endure the situation longer, she was about to risk a bold stroke, by which she would at once revenge herself on Vincent, escape from the torture of his society, and assure herself of Wyndham's friendship. After the preliminary commonplaces, She watched her opportunity till she could arrest Wyndham's eyes with hers, throwing into their expression all that she knew of pathos and appeal. Then she rose and held out her hand to Hardy, saying with distinct deliberation, "I'm afraid you must excuse me now, Vincent. I have to take Mr. Wyndham to call on my uncle Dean Craven." The look that she turned on Wyndham said plainly, "You see I'm desperate. If you haven't enough chivalry to back that up, I'm done for." Happily for her, this time Wyndham's chivalry was equal to his intelligence. He answered in the most natural manner possible, "If Miss Craven is ready, I am. As I'm rather late, I think we'd better take a hansom." They left Hardy stupefied with astonishment. As they drove towards Charing Cross, she turned to Wyndham and said, "Forgive my making use of you. Had you any other engagement?" "I have no engagements." "I am glad. It was the only thing I could think of to get rid of him. If you had left me he would have stayed. If I had gone out by myself he would have followed. But it was good of you to stand by me like that." "Not at all. I'm delighted to call on Dean Craven, still more delighted to be of service to you." "Thank you." They said no more till, as they came in sight of the Hotel Metropole, he turned to her with a smile. "Do you remember Mr. Jackson?" "Mr. Jackson, Mr. Jackson." She shook her head. "Oh yes, of course I do. At Oxford that night. Whatever put him into your head, of all people?" "Dean Craven, I suppose. Ridiculous association of ideas." "Mr. Jackson. I wonder why such people exist." "So do I. Do you know I've hated Mr. Jackson with a deadly hatred for the last month." "Why, whatever has he done?" "Nothing. But if it hadn't been for him I should have known you a year ago." The hansom drew up. She sank back into her corner and held out her hand. "I'll say good bye now. I'm not equal to seeing them after all. You can tell them you've seen me, and that I meant to call." "Very well. Is he to drive you straight home?" "Yes, please. But tell him to go the longest way round, by Fulham, or anywhere." He said good bye, got out, and gave the order to the driver. As the hansom turned up Northumberland Avenue, he caught a side view of the pathetic little face through the window. Then she was whirled away from him, towards Fulham or anywhere. He stood looking after her till the sound of the horses' bells was lost in the roar of Charing Cross. Then he remembered that he had once said she would be capable of anything. End of chapter 17. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 18 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 18. Hardy left the house 5 minutes after Audrey and Wyndham. In the doorway of the dining room he stepped on a small muslin pocket handkerchief. It was stained here and there with specks of blood. He picked it up, kissed it, and put it in his pocket. For a long time after that he had no clear sense of anything, except, at times, of the misery that made the only difference between being drunk and sober. Yes, Hardy was carrying out the threat he had made to Audrey, with a passionate deliberation. He was giving his whole mind to it, as he had said. He had been used to speak of the sins of his past life, with that exaggeration which was part of his character. They had been slight, considering the extent of his temptation. Then he was, as it were, an amateur in evil. Now he had an object in view. He was sinning for the wages of sin. After all, there was a boyish simplicity about Hardy. Otherwise the idea of living for a year alone on the Rockies, to make himself fit to love Audrey, would hardly have occurred to him. As it was, that guileless scheme proved fatal in its results. The loneliness, the privation, the excitement and fatigue of his sportsman's life, for with all his boasting he was a true sportsman, had roused some old hereditary impulse in his blood, and he found himself worsted by the craving for drink before he was aware of its existence in him. But the thought of Audrey was always present with him, and it kept him up. He fought himself hand to hand, and won the fight 10 times for once that he was beaten. He was literally saved by hope. Happily for him, when he had finished the stores he brought out with him, it was almost as difficult to satisfy his craving as it was to annihilate it. When he came home the tendency was sleeping in him still; and though, as long as he had hope, it might have slept for ever, When hope was gone it was there, ready to take possession of him. His love for Audrey was the strongest passion in his nature. It filled the horizon of his life. He looked before and after and could see nothing else but it. It was of the kind that deepens through its own monotony. Now that Audrey had cast him off there was no reason for the struggle, because there was nothing more to struggle for, and nothing to live for, unless it were to kill life in the act of living. That indeed was something. After the first month or so of it, he had no further interest in his present course. He chose it now as the form of suicide least likely to be recognized as such. Perhaps, who knows, if he had had any friends who would have given him a helping hand, it might never have come to this. But, in the first place, Hardy had no home that could be called a home. His mother was fond of him in her way, but she was now a hysterical invalid, abject under the influence of her second husband; and year by year his stepfather's jealousy, the jealousy of a childless man, had driven the mother and son further apart. Of the Havilands, whom he would naturally have turned to, he had seen nothing for the last few months. Ted disliked meeting him, and he on his part was equally anxious to avoid Ted. That was how Katherine remained ignorant of the truth until she was enlightened by Mrs. Rogers. "It ain't my business," said that excellent woman, as she began to dust the studio one morning, in the leisurely manner that Katherine dreaded, it being the invariable forerunner of conversation. "And I don't know whose business it is, but somebody ought to look after that Mr. Hardy. His friends ought to be written to, ma'am." Katherine felt a pang of remorse. "Why? Is Mr. Hardy ill?" "I didn't say he was ill. But if I was to tell you, miss—" Here Mrs. Rogers pursed her lips, not so much to impress Katherine with her incorruptible discretion as to excite interest in the disclosure she meant to make. "Between you and me, ma'am, if somebody don't stop him, he'll drink himself to death down there some of these days." "What do you mean? It's quite impossible. I've known Mr. Hardy all my life." "I've known him 3 months. If I wasn't that soft 'earted I wouldn't keep him a day longer, not a day I wouldn't. He won't sleep in his bed like a Christian, lies on top all of a heap like. Last week when I was a cleanin' out his bottom cupboard, the brandy bottles was standin' up like a row of ninepins. This mornin' they was lyin' down flat as your face, empty, ma'am, every one of 'em. It did give me a turn. And 'e'll order his dinner for 8 o'clock and not come home till 2 in the mornin', if he comes home at all. He's out now, Lord knows where." "I don't want to hear any more. You're very likely mistaken." "I wish I was, miss. But you'll not deceive me. I'm that upset with it all. And my fear is, miss, he'll drive away my old lady on the first floor with his goings on." Katherine left the room too deeply grieved to bear Mrs. Rogers' professional loquacity. That night she was able to realize the truth of what she had been told. She had gone out to dine with some new acquaintance. Ted had called for her to take her home, and they were walking back along the Embankment when they came suddenly upon Hardy. He was standing under a gas lamp, talking to somebody, or rather listening to somebody talking. He turned his back on them as they passed, but there was no mistaking his figure in the glare of the false daylight. As for his companion, Katherine was aware of something in satin skirts, which the gaslight ran over like water, something that smelt of musk and had hair the colour of brass. She walked on without a word, sick at heart. This was the first time she had been brought face to face with the hideous side of life. Like many good women, she thoroughly realized the existence of evil in the abstract, but evil incarnate in a person? It was hard to associate that with any one she knew as she had known Vincent. Her artistic nature was morbidly sensitive to impressions taken in through the eye, and nothing could have so forced home the truth as that little scene suddenly flashed on her out of the London night. But now that she had seen, it was not the horror that she felt, but the pity of it. She remembered Vincent's face when she had shown him Audrey's picture. Her thoughts went further back. She remembered him a boy, playing with her in a lordly manner, as befitted his sex. Or a young man coming and going in her father's home with frank, brotherly ways. She remembered how she had grudged the time she gave him, and the relief she felt when he left off coming. But she could not remember anywhere the least sign of what he had become. Something ought to be done. She could not clearly say what. Writing to his people, as Mrs. Rogers had suggested, was out of the question. She knew too well the state of things in his home. To be sure, there was his uncle. Sir Theophilus Parker, whom he had expectations from. But for that very reason the old gentleman was the last person whom it would be advisable to inform of Vincent's conduct. Relations failing, there remained his friends, and she only knew two of these, herself and Ted. All that was most fine and sensitive in her nature cried out against the burden she knew she would have to lay on it. But her humanity was so deeply moved by the tragedy she had twice been an unwilling spectator of, that she never so much as dreamed of asking, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Doubtless she could have found plenty of excellent people to tell her she was not. Her only difficulty was with Ted. Nothing could be done till he had got over his nervous dread of meeting Vincent. Katherine had no precise idea of what had passed between her brother and Audrey, and how far Vincent had been connected with it. But she had gathered from Ted's silence all that she wanted to know. Whatever Audrey had said or done, there was an end of her as far as he was concerned. It was from the boy's silence, too, that she realized the extent of his suffering. Before the inevitable thing had happened he had done nothing but talk of Audrey, sometimes with melancholy, more often in the jocular strain adopted by self-conscious persons to carry off some ridiculous fatality. Anger following suspense had driven him to think of suicide. But now that it was all over with him he had no idea of killing himself. Katherine had never been much afraid of that, and as yet none of the other things she had dreaded had happened. But it was evident that the boy's nature had been deeply affected, and that the shock was a moral one. It was not Audrey's unfaithfulness that had hurt him so much as her untruthfulness. Ted thought so little of himself in some ways that he could have understood the one, and therefore forgiven it. The other was the unpardonable sin. It injured what he loved better than himself, his idea of Audrey. Katherine did not know this, but she saw that the present time was the moral turning point in his life, and that his pain was the sort that shapes character for good or for evil. But, after all, she knew very little of the elements that went to make up Ted's character. His imagination, as she had pointed out to Audrey on a memorable occasion, had been developed long before his heart, and out of all proportion to it. It had so happened that all at once the passionate part of his nature had been roused and shaken before it was half formed. She asked herself what line would be taken now by those forces of feeling set free so violently and so abruptly checked. Well, at any rate Audrey's conduct had not had the effect of driving brother and sister apart. It had drawn them closer together, if anything. Ted seemed to find relief in Katherine's society from the torment of his own thoughts, and he had shown no desire to look for distraction abroad. Indeed, the difficulty was to make him go out of doors at all for necessary exercise. He would have fits of work when nothing would induce him to stir from the easel. Another time he would spend whole mornings lying on the floor, with his arms clasped above his head, or sitting with a book in his hands, a book which he never seemed to read. He hardly ever spoke; he was always thinking; and worse than all, he had lost his appetite and his sense of humour. Mrs. Rogers had her own theory on the subject, which she imparted to Katherine. "Miss, it's them baths as done it. Anything in reason and I'll not say no, but cold water to that extent, ma'am, it's against nature. It's my belief Mr. Haviland would have slept and had his dinner in his bath if I hadn't put my foot down. He's chilled his blood, depend upon it, ma'am." And indeed that seemed very likely. Katherine said nothing about Hardy at the time, but the next night, when she and Ted were sitting over the fire, she began. "Ted, that was Vincent we saw on the Embankment last night." "Yes, I saw him." "Do you know, I believe he's killing himself with drinking." "I know he is." "Do you think we could do anything to help him before it's too late?" He shook his head. "Oh, Ted, we might. He never used to be like this. He's got no one to speak to. We've left him by himself all this time in those horrid rooms. The wall paper alone is enough to send anybody to the bad. We might have thought of him." "I've done nothing else but think of him for the last 2 months. We can't do anything. He's bound to go on like that. I don't see how he can help it. As for drinking, nothing can stop that. I've seen fellows like him before, and Vincent never did anything by halves." "It's terrible. But we ought to try. It's the least we can do." "The least I can do is to keep out of his way. He hates the sight of me." "Why?" "Don't you know? Didn't it ever strike you that Audrey was engaged to Vincent all the time?" "No. I thought he liked her. But what makes you think that?" "I can't tell you. But any sort of affectionate advances would come rather badly from me. How's Vincent to know that I never knew?" "You may be sure he knows. He knows Audrey." Ted sighed, but he said nothing. There was nothing to be said. "Would you very much mind asking him to supper to morrow night?" "No, he won't come. But you'd better write to him yourself, or else he'll think you don't want him." She wrote a note, and Ted took it downstairs to be ready for Vincent at such time as he should come in. The boy turned into his own room without going up again to say good night. He had left Katherine thinking. She had been struck with his words; they had thrown a new light on his character. His tone was bitter when he told her he had been thinking of nothing but Vincent, but it was not the bitterness of selfish resentment. A shuddering hope went through her. Either there always had been things in Ted's nature which she had never suspected, or he had just begun his education by suffering, by having felt. The latter was the more probable explanation. She knew him to be capable of such absorption in pleasant sensations that if all had gone well with him he might from sheer light heartedness have remained indifferent to other people's woes. And all along he had been such an irresponsible person. But now he was actually growing a conscience, and a peculiarly delicate one too. Without any fault of his own he had behaved dishonourably to Vincent, and apart from the blow to his own honour, it was evident that what stung him now was remorse for his infinitesimal share in the causes that had led to Vincent's ruin. In all that he had said there was no trace of any lingering love for Audrey. Was it possible that the tragic spectacle of Vincent's fate had moved him too with pity and terror for the purging of his passion? Hardy did not find Katherine's note till late next morning. He read it twice over with an incredulous air, and put it into the fire. He wrote a short but grateful refusal, saying truly that he was very seedy, and not pleasant company for any one at present. Not long after, he was alone as usual in his dingy ground floor sitting room. It was about 5 o'clock, but he had not lit his lamp yet, and he had let his fire go out, though it was cold and rainy. A gas lamp from the street shone through the dripping window panes, bringing a dreary twilight into the room, making it one with the melancholy of the rain-swept streets. He sat by the table with his head in his hands, a prey to the appalling depression which was his mood when sober. For the last 3 months he had had a curious double consciousness of himself as an actor in a phantom world, lost in some night of dreams, where the same thoughts, always the same thoughts, thoughts that were sins, came to him in sickening recurrence, the horror of it being that the act followed instantaneously on the thought, of himself as a spectator, separate from that other self, yet bound to it, looking on at all it did, ashamed and loathing, yet powerless to interfere. And, as happens in nightmares, his very dread suggested the thing he dreaded, and changed his dream to something more hideous than before, horror upon horror, still foreseen, and still foredoomed in the senseless sequence of the dream. Now these two states of mind were divided by a little clear space. The passive self was free for a while and could think. It could think, that was all. He was waked from his thoughts by a knock and a voice at the door. He answered gruffly, and as he looked up he saw Katherine standing in the open doorway, letting in a stream of light from the lamp she carried in her hand. He stared at her stupidly, blinking at the light, and hid his face in his hands again. "I beg your pardon, Vincent. I knocked, and I thought you said 'come in.' I came to see how you were. I was afraid you were worse." "I am worse. What's more, I shall never be better." She put her lamp on the chimney piece and stood beside him. "Don't say that. Of course you'll be better. Can we do anything for you?" "No, nothing, thanks." She moved back a little and shaded the lamp with her hands. She was afraid to disturb him, but she did not like to leave him in his misery. How ill and wretched he looked in that abominable room! The lamplight showed her all its repulsive details. She had done her best for it, but in the last 2 months it had sunk back into something worse than its former ugliness, degraded in its owner's degradation. There was no trace now of the clever alterations and contrivances which she had devised for his comfort. The muslin curtains she had lent him were dark with smoke. The rug had slipped from the horsehair sofa. There were stains on the shabby tablecloth and carpet, and on the sideboard there was a sordid litter of bottles and glasses, pipes, tobacco ash, and Hardy's hats. The floor was strewn with the crumpled papers and shoes that he had flung away from him in his fits of irritation. In the midst of it all she noticed that Mrs. Rogers had brought back all her terrible household goods, the pink vases, the paper screens, and the antimacassars. To cheer him up, I suppose, poor fellow. Hardy looked round as if he had read her thoughts. "You'd better leave me. This isn't a nice place for you." "It isn't a very nice place for anybody. You've let your fire go out. Come upstairs and get warm. We haven't seen you for ages." He shook his head sadly. "I can't, Sis. I'm much too seedy." "Nonsense! You will be if you sit down here catching cold." She took up her lamp and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Come, don't keep me waiting, or I shall catch cold too." His will was in abeyance, and to her intense relief he got up and followed her. She was shocked at the change in his appearance when she saw him in the full lamplight of the studio. He was pitifully thin. His fingers, as he held out his hands to the blaze, were pale, even with the red glow of the fire through them. His eyes had lost their dog like pathos, and had the hard look of the human animal. She got ready some strong coffee and made him drink it. That, with the warmth and the unaccustomed kindness, revived him. Then she sat down in a low chair opposite him, with some sewing in her lap, so that he might talk to her or not, as he pleased. At first he evidently preferred to think, and when he did speak it was as if he were thinking aloud. "I was cut by two men I know to day. I wonder how many women there are in London who would do what you've done for me to night." "What have I done? I walked into your room without an invitation. I don't suppose many women in London would have done that. But is there any woman in London who has known you as long as I have?" He winced perceptibly, and she remembered that there was one. "Ah, if you really knew me, Kathy, you'd cut me dead." "My dear Vincent, don't talk rubbish. I do know a good deal. And I'm very sorry, that's all. I should be sorrier if I thought it was going to last for ever. But I don't." "You are too good to me. But if you only knew." He sat silent, watching as she sewed. Something in his attitude reminded her of that other evening, 3 months ago, when he had lain back in that chair, boasting gloriously, full of hope and the pride of life. He appealed to her more now in his illness and degradation than he had ever done in his splendid sanity. For he had seemed so strong. There was no outward sign of weakness then about that long limbed athlete. "Vincent," she said presently, "what's become of the Pioneer book? You promised to read me some of it, don't you remember?" "Yes, I shall never do anything with it now." "Oh, Vincent, what a pity! But if it's not to be printed, do you mind my seeing the manuscript?" "No, I'll let you have it some day, Sis, and you shall do what you like with it." He sank into silence again. "Where's Ted?" he asked suddenly. "He'll be in soon. He wants to see you." "Does he? How do you know that?" There was a look of suspicion in Hardy's eyes as they glanced up. It was a symptom of his miserable condition that he was apt to imagine slights. "I've only his word for it, of course." "Kathy," he hesitated. "Well?" "There's something I wanted to tell him, but the fact is I don't think I've the pluck to do it." "Never mind then. Tell me if you can, though I think I know. And it's all right." "No, it isn't all right. I suppose you know he was pretty well off his head about that cousin of mine. I rather think he owed me one for being before him, as he thought. At any rate, he cut me ever since, before I took to the flowing bowl, too. You might tell him, if you think it would be any satisfaction to him to know it, that she cared rather less for me than she did for him. In fact, I believe there was some unhappy devil that she preferred to either of us. At least a third man came into it somewhere. There may be a fourth now, for anything I know." There was a brutality about his calmness which surprised Katherine. She could not realise the effect of the means he used for blunting his sensibilities. "You're quite mistaken. Ted hasn't any feeling of the sort. He simply kept out of your way because he was afraid you'd think he had behaved dishonourably. And of course he couldn't explain because of Audrey." "But it wasn't his fault. He knew nothing." "I never thought he did know. Do you suppose I blamed him, poor beggar?" All the same, Hardy slunk away, soon after Ted came in. When Mrs. Rogers came up with supper, she informed them that it was fine now, if you could but trust it. "And Mr. 'Ardy 'ave gone off like a mad thing. Temptin' Providence, I call it, without an umbrella." Ted remarked as they sat down to supper that he thought Providence would have sufficient strength of mind to resist temptation, but he was not so sure about Hardy. And indeed Katherine had to own that her first experiment with Vincent was a failure. But she struggled on, experience having taught her that it is easier to do good original work of your own than to patch up what other people have spoiled. One week, drawn by some yearning for human sympathy, Hardy would come nearly every evening to the studio. Then they would see no more of him for 10 days or so. At times she felt that the strain of it was greater than she could bear. She had learnt to manage Vincent in his various moods, varying from humorous irascibility to hysterical penitence. But when he was out of her sight her influence was powerless. Now indeed she asked herself, "Why am I wasting my precious time, and making myself miserable in this way? I've no sense of religion, and I don't love Vincent. He's simply a nuisance. It must be sheer obstinacy." It was with a feeling little short of despair that she sat down to the pages of the Pioneer book. She had determined at any cost to read the manuscript through, but she soon became fascinated in spite of herself. "Be tender to it, Sis, it's a part of myself," he had said when he handed it over to her. She thought he had detected a gleam of interest in his face, and felt that she was on the right tack. But Vincent's book was more than a part of himself, it was a fair transcript of the whole. His weakness and his strength were in it. She saw his vanity, his exaggeration, but also his sincerity, his manliness, his simple delight in simple things. Scenery on a large scale stirred a strain of rude poetry in him that was akin to the first rhythmic utterances of man. To be sure, the thing had its faults, for poor Vincent had been anxious that his book should be recognised as the work of a scholar and a gentleman. At times a spirit of unbridled quotation would seize him, and you came upon familiar gems from the classics embedded in the text. At times, after some coarse but graphic touch, his style became suddenly refined, almost to sickliness. When he was not pointing his moral with a hatchet, he was adorning his tale with verbiage gathered from the worst authors. But if Hardy the literary artist made her laugh till she cried again, Hardy the unconscious child of nature won her heart. If only she could make him finish what he had begun. She determined to illustrate the book. That might inflame Vincent's ambition, and would certainly require his co operation. So now, every evening, in the spare time after supper, she set to work on the drawings, aided by some photographs and rough sketches made by Hardy. After a little stratagem she got him to come up and help her with suggestions, or to sit for her while she sketched him in all the attitudes of the sportsman. He was enthusiastic over the first few drawings. Perhaps his simple remarks, That's clever," or "By Jove, that's not half bad," gave her a purer pleasure than she could have derived from the most discriminating criticism. When his interest showed signs of flagging, she hit on a new means of rousing it. She began to find out that so long as she drew correctly, he looked on with a melancholy indifference, but that when she made any mistake he was always delighted to put her right. So she went on making mistakes, and then Vincent got impatient. "Look here, Sis, that's all wrong. You don't carry a rifle with the muzzle pointing towards your left ear. Here, give the thing to me." Katherine gravely handed him another sketch. "How's that?" "That's worse. Why, you little duffer, you don't suppose I'm going to send a bullet into that bear taking aim at that angle? I should blow my boots off. I thought you could draw." She smiled in secret. "So I can, if you'll show me which way up the things go." Then they put their heads together over it, and between them they turned out some work worthy of the Pioneer book. Ted joined in too, and began a black and white series of his own, parodying the acts of the distinguished sportsman. Vincent attacked by a skunk, Vincent swarming up a pine tree with a bear hanging on to his trousers legs, Vincent shooting the rapids in his canoe, canoe uppermost, and so on. Ted was so much entertained with his own performances that he was actually heard to laugh. And when the boy laughed, the man laughed too. As for Katherine, she could have cried, knowing that a returning sense of humour is often the surest sign of hope in these cases. Laughter, flattery, and feminine wiles may not be the methods most commended by moralists and divines for the conversion of poor sinners. But Katherine seldom consulted authorities. She had the courage of her convictions. One fine morning in February she appeared in her hat and jacket at the door of the ground floor sitting room. "Vincent, will you come with me to the Zoo? I'm going to do some grizzlies and wapiti from the life for the Pioneer book, and I want you to help me." He agreed, and they started almost gaily, with Mrs. Rogers peering up at them from the front area window, putting that and that together with the ingenuity of her kind. It was the first of many walks they had together. Ted generally went with them, but now and again he was left behind. At these times Katherine was touched by Vincent's pride in being allowed to take her about alone. He was grateful for it. He knew it was her way of showing that she trusted him. At last the series of illustrations came to an end. The two artists had raced each other. Katherine, having had the start, came in first at the finish with a magnificent design for the cover. She brought the drawings to Vincent, together with his manuscript, and showed them to him triumphantly. He remarked, "Well, they ought to print the thing, if only as a footnote to your drawings, Sis." "Will you sit down and finish it, if I undertake to find a publisher?" He promised, and he kept his word. In the mornings now he might be found working slowly and painfully at his last chapter, she helping him. So the winter wore on into spring, and Katherine, burdened with arrears of work, said to herself, "I perceive that this is going to be an expensive undertaking." But she looked back gladly on the time lost. At last, after many failures, they had succeeded in wakening Vincent to a sense of distant kinship with the life of boys and maidens. Down at the bottom of his nature there had always been an intense craving for affection, and his heart went out to Ted and Katherine. Not that he considered himself fit for their blameless society. Together with the vices he had acquired there had sprung up humility, that strange virtue, which has its deepest roots in the soil of shame. But all his old yearning after goodness revived in their presence. When he was with them he felt that the cloud of foul experience was lifted for a moment from his mind. They gave him sweet thoughts instead of bitter, for a day perhaps, or a night. And what of the days and the nights when he was not with them? Then, as a rule, he fell, 9 times, it may be, out of every 10, who knows? And who knows whether perfect justice, measuring our forces with the force of our temptations, may not count as victory what the world calls defeat. End of chapter 18. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 19 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 19. In her appeal to Wyndham, Audrey had played a bold stroke, and it seemed that she had won it. She had amply revenged herself on Hardy, and more than assured herself of Wyndham's friendship. All the same, ever since she had left him at the doors of the Hotel Metropole, a certain constraint had crept into their intercourse. Wyndham was not easily deceived, and he rightly interpreted her abrupt dismissal of him as a final effort to assert herself before the onset of the inevitable. Even if he at times suspected her of playing a part, she had chosen the right part to play, and he respected her for it. He himself was leading a curious double life. He was working hard at his novel, which promised to surpass everything that he had yet done. He was so much absorbed in observing, studying, shaping, and touching up, that it never occurred to him to ask himself if he were indeed creating. The thing had been growing under his hands through the autumn. In the winter it seemed to advance by bounds, but in the spring his work came to a sudden standstill. He did not know what Laura, his heroine, was going to do next. He had drawn her as the creature of impulse, but dragging the dead weight of all the conventions at her back, a woman variously dramatic when stirred by influences from without, but incapable of decisive action from within. How would such a woman behave under stress of conflicting circumstances, if it came, say, to a fight for possession between the force of traditional inertia and the feeling of the moment? On the one hand, the problem was as old as the hills; on the other, it was new with every man and woman born into the world. What he called his literary conscience told him that it had to be solved. Another conscience in him shrank from the solution. At this point Wyndham did what, as a conscientious artist, he had never done before. He put his work away for a season, and tried not to think about it, devoting himself to Audrey Craven instead. Even he was not always able to preserve the critical attitude with regard to her. As he had told her, criticism comes first, sympathy last of all. And with him, last of all, it had come. He could not go on from day to day, seeing, hearing, and understanding more and more, without acquiring a curious sympathy with the thing he studied. And when the artist tired of her art, the man felt all the influence of her natural magic. He was prepared for that, and had no illusions on the subject. He tested his present feelings by comparing them with those he had had for Alison Fraser. He had not the least intention of setting up Audrey Craven anywhere near his idol's ancient place. He would have shuddered at the bare idea of it. This, though he expressed it differently, was what he meant when he resolved once for all that he would never marry, never put himself in any woman's power again. And in the plenitude of his self knowledge he knew exactly how far he could let himself go without either of these evil results following. Unfortunately in these cases the woman is seldom so well equipped for self defence as the man. Owing to her invincible ignorance of her own nature, she must be more or less at a disadvantage. And if this is true of women in general, it was doubly true of any one so specially prone to illusion as Audrey Craven, who would have had difficulty in recognizing any part of her true self under its numerous disguises. She was therefore unaware of the action and reaction which had been going on within her during the last year. Whatever its precise quality may have been, her love for Ted Haviland was of a different quality from her feeling for Langley Wyndham. Under that earlier influence, whatever intelligence she possessed had been roused from its torpor by the tumult of her senses. Her mind had been opened and made ready for the attack of a finer intellectual passion, which again in its turn brought her under the tyranny of the senses. For though her worst enemies could not call Audrey clever, it was Wyndham's intellectual eminence which had fascinated her from the first. Herein lay her danger and her excuse. She was aware, hence her late access of reserve, that she was being carried away by her feelings; but how, when, and whither, she neither knew nor apparently cared to know. In the meanwhile, in Wyndham's friendship she not only triumphed over Vincent's scorn, but she felt secure against his infatuation. For she imagined the scorn and the infatuation as still existing together. She knew that he was still in London, presumably unable to tear himself away from her neighbourhood. And the sense of his presence, of his power over her, had been so long a habit of her mind that she could not lose it now. Otherwise she hardly gave him a thought, and having cut herself off from all communication with Devon Street, she did not certainly know what had become of him. She had yet to learn. Towards the end of February she received a letter from Vincent's mother which left no doubt on the subject. The news of his downfall had reached his home at last. Mrs. Hardy knew of her son's attachment to his cousin, and had always had fixed ideas on that point. On being told that he had gone irretrievably to the bad, she jumped to a conclusion. It was the right one, as it happened, though she had managed to cover a great deal of ground in that jump. She at once wrote off a long and violent letter to her niece, taxing her with cruelty, fickleness, and ingratitude, laying Vincent's misdeeds on her shoulders, and ending thus: "They tell me you are engaged. I pray God you may not have to go through what you have made my darling boy suffer." Now, either the poor hysterical lady was an unconscious instrument in the hands of destiny, or her prayer may have been meant as a modified and ladylike curse. At any rate, if it had not entered into her head to write that letter, it would have saved the writing of one chapter in her niece's history. But in the first place the communication had the effect of making Audrey cry a great deal for her. In the second, it came by an afternoon post, so that Langley Wyndham, calling at his usual hour, found her crying. He was a little taken aback by the sight, as indeed any man would have been, for most women of his acquaintance arranged things so as not to do their crying and calling hours. However, he judged it the truest kindness to sit down and talk as if nothing had happened. But it requires considerable self possession and command of language to sit still and talk about the weather with a woman's tears falling before you like rain. And even Langley Wyndham, that studious cultivator of phrases, found it hard. Audrey herself relieved him from his embarrassment by frankly drying her eyes and saying, "I beg your pardon, I didn't mean that to happen, but—" He glanced at the letter open in her lap. "Not bad news, I hope?" "No," she answered, with a sob verging on the hysterical. Wyndham looked frightened at that, and she checked herself in time. "No, it's nothing. At least I can't speak about it, and yet, if I did, I believe I should feel better. I am so miserable." "I am truly sorry. I wish I could be of some use. If you thought you could speak about it to me, you know you can trust me." "I know I can. Oh, if I could only tell you, but I can't." "Why not? Would it be so very hard? "I might be able to help you." "You might. I do want somebody's advice so much." "You are always welcome to mine. You needn't take it, you know." She smiled through her tears, for she had acquired a faint sense of humour under Ted's influence, and had not yet lost it. "Well, it's about my cousin Mr. Hardy. You remember meeting him here once?" "I do indeed." "You may remember something I told you about him then. Perhaps I ought not to have told you." "Never mind that. Yes, I remember perfectly. Has he been persecuting you again?" Yes. Well, no. I haven't seen him for ages, but I live in dread of seeing him every day. I know sooner or later he will come." She paused. "I wonder if I really could tell you everything." "Please do, or tell me as much as you care to. I'd like to help you if you would let me." She went on in a low voice, rather suggestive, Wyndham thought, of the confessional. "I was engaged to him once, long ago. He forced me into it. It began when we were children. He always made me do everything he wanted. Then he went away immediately after for a year. When he came back, I don't know how it was, I suppose it was because he had been away so long, but I was stronger. He seemed to have lost his hold over me, and I broke it off." She looked away from Wyndham as she spoke. He wondered, is she acting all the time? If so, how admirably she does it. She must be a cleverer woman than I thought, but she isn't a clever woman. Therefore But Audrey went on before he could draw a conclusion. "But I know some day he will come back and make it begin all over again, and I shall have no power, and the thought of it is horrible." There was no mistaking the passion in her voice this time. He said to himself, "This is nature," and he felt the same cold shiver of sympathy that sometimes ran through him at the performance of some splendid actress. But before he could presume to sympathize, he must judge. "Do you mind telling me one thing? Had you any graver reasons for breaking it off than what you have told me?" "Yes. He drinks." "Brute. That's enough. But supposing he didn't drink?" "It would make no difference. I never cared for him. He thought I did. I couldn't help that, could I? And then afterwards so many things happened. I was not the same person. If he had not begun to do that, still it would have been impossible. But he won't believe it, or else he doesn't care. He'll persecute me again, and perhaps make me marry him." "My dear Miss Craven, he won't do that. People don't do those things in the 19th century. You've only got to state clearly that you won't have anything to say to him, and he can't do anything. If he tries to, there are measures that can be taken." She shook her head dismally. "Now comes the advice. Shall I tell you the truth? You've been worrying your brain over that wretched animal till your nerves are all upset. You're ill practically, or you couldn't take this morbid view of it. You ought to leave town and go away for a change." "Where could I go to?" "The south coast for choice. It's bracing." "If I only could. No, I can't leave London." "Why not?" "There's an excellent service of trains." "Because I love London." "Well, so do I, for many reasons. There's no place like it to my mind. But if I'd overworked myself in it I should tear myself away. You can have too much of a good thing." "No, not of the only place on earth you care to be in." "Well, I've given my valuable advice. You're not going to take it. I never thought you would. Personally, I hate the people who give me advice. What I should like to give you would be help. But the question is, am I able to give it? Have I even the right to offer it?" She looked up at him. Some lyric voice, whether of hope or joy or both, had called the soul for an instant to her face, a poor little fluttering soul that gazed out through her grey eyes at Wyndham, for an instant only, and was seen no more. When he spoke not to it, but to the woman he had known. "You don't answer." She had answered, and he knew it. "It all comes back to what I said long ago. The most elementary knowledge of life would have saved you all this. If you'd had it, you could not have let these fatuities worry you to this extent. Do you remember my telling you that you ought to love life for its own sake?" The moment he had said the words he would have given anything to recall them. But it was too late. She remembered only too well. However she had disguised the truth, Wyndham's passionate defence of realism was not altogether an appeal to her intellect. He ought not to have reminded her of that now. "Yes," she answered. "How could I forget?" "I said at the time that you must know life in order to love it, and I say so now. But Audrey " She started and flushed. If I were another man I should not say that." "What would you say?" "That you must love in order to know." "Is there any need to tell me that now?" "Perhaps not. It's what I would have told you then if I had been another man." Her lip quivered slightly, and she held one hand with the other to give herself the feeling of a human touch. He went on without the least idea whether he were talking sense or nonsense, interrupted sometimes by his own conscience, sometimes by Audrey's changes of expression. "Bear with my egoism a moment several moments, for I'm going to be tediously autobiographical. Once, when I was a young man, I was offered some journalistic work. It was at the very start. I had barely tasted print. Remember, I was ambitious, and it meant the beginning of a career. I was poor, and it meant a good salary. But it meant the production of a column of copy a day, whether I was in the vein for it or no. I wanted it badly, and I refused it. I could not be tied down. Since then I have never bound myself to any publisher or editor. This anecdote is not in the least interesting, but it is characteristic of my whole nature, which is my reason for inflicting it on you. That nature may be an unfortunate one, but I didn't invent it myself. Anyhow, knowing it as thoroughly as I do, I've made up my mind never to do certain things, never, for instance, to ask any woman to be my wife. Marriage is the one impossible thing. It involves duty, or worse still, duties. Now, as it happens, I consider duty to be the very lowest of moral motives. In fact, don't be shocked, it isn't moral at all. It is to conduct what authority is to belief. That is, it has nothing whatever to do with it. No, goodness no more depends on duty than truth depends on authority. Forgive me, I know you are a metaphysician and a moral philosopher, and you'll appreciate this. You're going to make a quotation, please don't. It's perfectly useless to tell me that Wordsworth calls duty "stern daughter of the voice of God." It may be, I don't know. I only know that if I believed it was my duty to live, I'd commit suicide to morrow. I don't like stern daughters. But granted that Wordsworth had the facts at his finger ends, God's voice is freedom, whatever its daughters may be. That's not a doctrine I'd preach to every one, but for me and those like me, freedom, absolute freedom, is the condition of all sane thinking and feeling. Fancy loving any one because it was your duty! Take a case. Supposing I married. The more I loved my wife, the less a free agent I should be. And when I once realized that I wasn't free, there would be an end of my love. I deplore this state of things, but I can't alter it. So you see, when I most want to give you love and protection, I can only offer you friendship, which you don't want perhaps, and good advice, which you won't take." But she was looking beyond him, far away. "As I can't possibly ask you to accept my conditions, perhaps the cleverest thing I could do would be to go away and never see you again. There's no other alternative." Her lips parted as if she would have spoken, but no words came. They searched each other's faces, the woman thirsting for life, for love, the man thirsting too for knowledge, and he knew. It was his turn to look away from her, and as he fixed his eyes absently on the corner where the Psyche stood motionless on her pedestal, he noticed, as people will notice at these moments, the ironical suggestion of the torso, with the nasty Malay frieze hanging over its head. Psyche and the sword of Damocles. "I don't want you to go away," she said, at last. "I am going, all the same. For a little while, a fortnight perhaps. I want you to have time to think." He was not by any means sure what he meant by that. He had solved his problem, though not quite as he had intended to, and that was enough for him. And yet his conscience not the literary one, but the other would not altogether acquit him of treachery to Audrey. Instead of going away, as he ought to have done, he sat on talking, in the hope of silencing the reproachful voice inside him, of setting things on their ordinary footing again. But this was impossible at the moment. They were talking now across some thin barrier woven of trivialities, as it were some half transparent Japanese screen, with all sorts of frivolous figures painted on it in an absurd perspective. And behind this flimsy partition their human life went on, each soul playing its part more or less earnestly in a little tragedy of temptation. Each knew all the time what the other was doing, though Wyndham had still the advantage of Audrey in this respect. Which of them would first have the courage to pull down the screen and face the solid, impenetrable truth? Neither of them attempted it. They dared not. After half an hour's commonplaces Wyndham left her to think. He too had some matter for reflection. He was not inhuman, and if at times he seemed so, he had ways of reconciling his inhumanity to his conscience. He told himself that his strictly impartial attitude as a student of human nature enabled him to do these things. He was as a higher intelligence, looking down on the crowd of struggling, suffering men and women beneath him, forgiving, tolerating all, because he understood all. He who saw life so whole, who knew the hidden motives and far off causes of human action, could make allowances for everything. There was something divine in his literary charity. What matter, then, if he now and then looked into some girl's expressive face, and found out the secret she thought she was hiding so cleverly from everybody? If he knew the sources of so and so's mysterious illness which had puzzled the doctors so long? And what if he had obtained something more than a passing glimpse into the nature of the woman who had trusted him? It would have been base, impossible in any other man, of course. The impersonal point of view, you see, made all the difference. End of chapter 19. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 20 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 20. From that afternoon Wyndham kept away from Chelsea Gardens. In fact, he had left town. To do him justice, he honestly thought he was doing the cleverest thing for Audrey in leaving her, to think. It would have been the cleverest thing if he could have kept away altogether, but as long as she had the certainty of his return, it was about the stupidest. If he had stayed, they would have resumed their ordinary relations. All might have blown over like a mood, and whatever he knew about her, Audrey herself would never have known it. As it was, he had emphasized the situation by going. And what was more, he had thrown Audrey back on her uninteresting self, the very worst company she could have had at present. She had been used to seeing him almost daily through a whole winter. He had made her dependent on his society for all her interests and pleasures, and when she was suddenly deprived of it, instead of being able to think, she spent her time in miserable longing. She could not think and feel at the same time. Feeling such as hers was incompatible with any form of thinking. It was feeling in a vacuum, the most dangerous kind of all. The emptiness of her life, now that Wyndham was gone, made her say to herself that she could bear anything, anything but that. It made her realize what the years, the long unspeakable years, would be like when she had given him up. She looked behind and around her, and there were the grey levels of ordinary existence. She looked below her, and there was the deep. She was going into the darkness of it, swiftly, helplessly, blown on by the wind of vanity. She saw no darkness for the light before her, a nebulous light, but it dazzled her like the sun shining through a fog. Once, at the fiercest point of her temptation, she felt an impulse to confession, that mysterious instinct which lies somewhere at the heart of all humanity. She had wild thoughts of going to Katherine and telling her all, asking her what she ought to do. Katherine was large minded, she would not blame her much. Perhaps she would tell her she ought not to give Wyndham up, that she ought to think of him, to be ready to sacrifice the world for his sake. Yes, Katherine was so clever, she would be a good judge, and Audrey would abide by her judgment. Unhappily, when it came to the point, she was afraid of her judgment. She had always been a little afraid of Katherine. Once she even thought of going to Mr. Flaxman Reed, that holy anachronism, as she had once heard Wyndham call him. But his judgment was a foregone conclusion. Mr. Flaxman Reed was not large-minded. Once, too, a gleam of reason came to her. She loved dearly the admiration and good opinion of her world, and she reflected that the step she contemplated meant no congratulations, no wedding dress, no presents, and no callers. Wedding, indeed! As she had read of a similar case in London legends, it would be a social funeral with no flowers by request. But these considerations had no weight after an evening spent with Cousin Bella. And though she played on her piano till the lace butterflies on Miss Craven's cap fluttered again (why would Cousin Bella wear caps in defiance of the fashion?), It was no good. If she had had a fine voice she would have sung at the top of it. Failing that medium of expression, she longed to put her fingers in her own ears and scream into Cousin Bella's. And as they yawned in each other's faces, and she realized that something like this might be the programme for an indefinite time, she remembered how Langley had called her a metaphysician and a moral philosopher. It was on statements like these, apparently borne out by the fact of his friendship, that she based the flattering fiction of her own intellectuality. Without that fiction Audrey could not have supported life in the rare atmosphere she had accustomed herself to breathe. The conclusion of it all was that, come what might come, she could not give Langley up. One afternoon she crossed the river for a walk in Battersea Park. It was a warm spring, and down the long avenue the trees were tipped with the flame of bursting buds, like so many green lights turned low. The beds and borders were gay with crocuses and hyacinths, and the open spaces were beginning to look green again. Audrey cared little for these things, but today she was somehow aware of them. She felt in her the new life of the spring as she had felt it a year ago. She walked rapidly from sheer excitement till she had tired herself out. Then she sat down on one of the benches overlooking the waste ground where the children played. Except for a bright fringe under the iron railings, it was still untouched by spring, and the sallow grass had long been trodden into the dust. Some ragged little cricketers were shouting not far off, and near her by the railings was a family group, a young father and mother with their children from 2 years old and upwards, crawling around them. They were enjoying a picnic tea in the sunshine, with the voluptuous carelessness of outward show that marks the children of the people. Audrey looked at it all with a faint disgust, but she was too tired to move on to a more cheerful spot. She turned her back on the picnic party and began to think about Wyndham. He had been away 10 days. He said he was going for a fortnight. In another week, at the longest, she would see him. She was roused by a tug at her petticoats. The 2-year-old, attracted like some wild animal by her stillness, had scrambled through the railings and was trying to pull its fat little body up by one hand on to the bench beside her. Its other hand grasped firmly a sheaf of fresh grass. It was clean and pretty, and something in its baby face sent a pang to Audrey's heart. She loosened its chubby fingers, hoping it would toddle away, but it gave a wilful chuckle, and stood still, staring at her, reproaching, accusing, in the unconscious cruelty of its innocence. And yet surely the divine charity had chosen the tenderest and most delicate means of stirring into life her unborn conscience. Moved by who knows what better impulse, she stooped suddenly down and touched its face with the tips of her gloved fingers. Startled at the strange caress, like some animal stroked too lightly, the little thing made its face swelled and asserted its humanity by a howl. Then it fled from her with a passionate waddle, scattering blades of grass behind it as it went. Even so do we chase away from us the ministers of grace. She leaned back, overcome by a sort of moral exhaustion. Her self-love was hurt, as it would have been if a dog had shrunk from her advances. For Audrey was not accustomed to have her favours rejected. She was further irritated by the ostentatious affection of the child's mother, as she helped it through the railings with shrill cries of "There then, Blossoms! Did she then, the naughty lady?" And when baby echoed "Naughty lady," it was as if the 2-year-old had judged her. She sat a little while longer and then went away. As she rose she looked sadly back at the family group. The man was lying on his back and letting the children walk about on the top of him. Baby had found peace in sucking an orange and stamping on her father's waist. The woman was strewing paper bags and orange peel around her in a fine disorder, while she thriftily packed the remains of their meal in a basket. Audrey shuddered. Their arrangements were all so ugly and unpleasant. And yet they were married, they were respectable, they were happy, these terrible people, while she was miserable. She had no sense of justice, and she rebelled against the policy of nature, who leaves her coarser children free, and levies her taxes on the aristocracy of feeling. The sordid domesticity of the scene had glorified by contrast her own dramatic mood. Poor Audrey! She hated vulgarity, and yet she was trying to lay hold on the great things of life through the vulgarest of all life's tragedies. Langley would be in town again in a week. He would ask if she had made up her mind, and she knew now too well the answer she would give him. But Langley was not in town again in a week, nor yet in a fortnight; and when at the end of 6 weeks he did come back, he came back married to Miss Alison Fraser. Nobody ever knew how that came about. Miss Gladys Armstrong, who may be considered an authority, maintained that as Wyndham had the pride which is supposed to be the peculiar property of the Evil One, he could never have proposed to the same woman twice. Consequently Miss Fraser must have proposed to him. Perhaps she had. There are ways of doing these things, and whatever Alison Fraser did, she did gracefully. As for her private conscience, in refusing him with conscious magnanimity, she had done no good to anybody, not even herself. In marrying him finally, she had saved the situation, without knowing that there was a situation to be saved. The news threw Audrey into what she imagined to be the beginning of a brain fever, but which proved to be a state of nervous collapse lasting with some intermissions for a fortnight. At the end of that time, whether it was that she was so fickle a creature that even fate could make no abiding impression on her, or that she was no longer burdened with the decision of a momentous question, to all appearances she recovered; so much so that when some one sent her an invitation to the private view at the New Gallery, she put on her best clothes, not without a pang, and went. Alas! The place was full of associations, melancholy with the sheeted ghosts of the past. This time last year she had been to the private view with Ted. They had amused themselves with laughing at the pictures, and wondering how long it would be before one of his would be hanging there. And as she listlessly turned the pages of her catalogue, the first names that caught her attention were Haviland Catherine, 232; Haviland Edward, 296. She turned back the pages hastily to number 232 and read The Witch of Atlas. That picture she knew. Number 296 gave her Sappho, a study of a head. Of a head? Whose head? She found the picture, not exactly in the place of honour, but agreeably well hung and with a small crowd before it, and recognized Katherine's striking profile, raised in the attitude of a suppliant who implores, the cloud of her dark hair flaming into bronze against a sunset sky. Ted was rather too fond of that trick, but the study was not a mere vulgar success. He had achieved expression in it. It was marked "Sold." There were some lines of verse on the square panel at the base of the frame. Ted could not have afforded such a setting for his picture, but the frame was contributed by Mr. Percival Knowles, the purchaser of the canvas. The same gentleman was also the author of the verse specially written for the portrait. Knowles, by the by, was an occasional poet; that is to say, he could burst into poetry occasionally. And Audrey read: "O Aphrodite, queen of dread desire, by all the dreams that throng love's golden ways, by all the honeyed vows thy votary pays, by sacrificial wine and holy fire. Thou who hast made my heart thy living lyre, hast thou no gift for me, nor any grace? Why hast thou turned the light of love's sweet face from me, the sweetest singer of love's choir? For songs that charm the long ambrosial years, the gods bring many gifts, and mine shall be Immortal life in mortal agony, vain longing fanned by winged hopes and fears to inextinguishable flame, and tears bitter as death, salt as the Lesbian sea." Her breast rose and fell with the lines. By this time she was educated up to their feeling. "Who was Sappho, and what did she do? I know, but I've forgotten," asked a voice in the crowd. "Oh, the woman who threw herself at the other fellow's head, you know, who naturally didn't appreciate the compliment." Audrey was not intelligent enough to refrain from the inward comment: "How singularly inappropriate! I should have said Katherine was about the last person in the world to—" She turned round and found herself face to face with the poet. Knowles had been wandering through the crowd with evasive eyes, successfully dodging the ladies of his acquaintance, while his air of abstraction took all quality of offence from the unerring precision of his movements. But when he saw Miss Craven he stopped. He had an inkling of the truth, and respected her feelings too much to slight her while Wyndham's marriage was still a topic of the hour. "Not bad for the boy, that," said he, smiling gently at Sappho. "He's coming out, isn't he?" "So are you, I think, in a new line, too." Not quite a new one. I've been taken that way before." She was about to make some pretty speech when they were joined by Ted, who had not noticed Audrey. His forehead puckered slightly when he saw her, but that was no doubt from sympathy with her probable embarrassment. For the first time in their acquaintance he was indifferent to the touch of the small hand that had tried to mould his destiny. If the truth must be told, in the flush of his success Ted had found out that his passion for Audrey was only the flickering of the flame on the altar dedicated to eternal art. He listened to her compliments without that sense of apotheosis which, however low he rated it, her criticism had been wont to produce. "Don't let's be seen looking at it any longer," he said at last. "Let's go and pretend to get excited about some other fellow's work." So they left Audrey to herself. She turned back and went down the room to see the Witch of Atlas, the lady robed in her subtle veil of starbeams and mist. Her view of this picture was somewhat obstructed by a stout gentleman, who, together with a thin lady, was taking up the whole of the available space before it. His companion, a badly dressed young woman with a double eyeglass, was trying to decipher the lines quoted in her catalogue. As Audrey paused, she looked up and stared, as only a woman with a double eyeglass can stare, at the same time attracting the stout gentleman's attention by a movement of her elbow. "Look, uncle, quick, that's her! That's the person!" "What's that, Nettie?" The stout gentleman swung round, as if on a pivot, as Audrey moved gracefully by. "You don't mean to say so! Where's Ted?" She walked on through the rooms, depressed by the meeting with Knowles. It suggested Wyndham. She would be meeting him next. And indeed she met him in the first gallery, where her aimless wanderings had brought her again. His wife was with him. Audrey knew that she must meet her some time, and she had expected to see in Alison Fraser an enlarged edition of herself. She had even feared an édition de luxe, which would have been intolerable. She was prepared for distinction, but she saw with a finer agony the slight figure, the sweet proud face with its setting of pale gold hair, and worse than all, the indefinable air of remoteness and reserve which made Mrs. Langley Wyndham more than a distinguished woman. Wyndham lifted his hat and would have passed on, but Audrey, to show her perfect self possession, stopped and held out her hand. He felt it trembling as he took it in a preoccupied manner, and Mrs. Langley Wyndham became instantly absorbed in picture number one. "Have you seen young Haviland's performance?" asked Wyndham. He had to say something. "Yes, it's a very fine study." "So Knowles tells me; but everything's a fine study in this collection. There ought to be a fine for the abuse of that expression." "But it really is. Go and see for yourself." "It's his sister, isn't it?" "Yes." "Ah, that accounts for it. He could give his mind to it in that case." Wyndham was surprised at his own fatuity. His remarks sounded like the weird inanities that pass for witticisms in dreams. "Perhaps. But never mind Mr. Haviland. I want you to introduce me to your wife." Wyndham looked round. His wife had turned an unconscious back. "Oh, thank you, you're very kind, but we're just going." He had not meant them so, but his words were like a whip laid across Audrey's shoulders. He moved on, and his wife joined him. Audrey came across them half an hour later, stooping over some design in black and white. She saw Mrs. Langley Wyndham look up in her husband's face with a smile, raising her golden eyebrows. The look was one of those intimate trifles that have no meaning beyond the two persons concerned in it. For Audrey, smarting from Wyndham's insult, it was the flick of the lash in her face. End of chapter 20. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 21 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 21. In the autumn of that year Audrey woke and found herself the classic of the hour, a literary queen without a rival. Wyndham's great work was finished, and it stood alone. Not another heroine of fiction could lift her head beside Laura, the leading character of An Idyll of Piccadilly. He himself owned, almost with emotion, that it was the best thing he had ever done. He had not touched the surface this time, he had gone deep down to the springs of human nature. He had not merely analysed the woman till her character lay in ruins around him, but he had built her up again out of the psychic atoms, and Laura was alive. She showed the hand of the master by her own nullity. In her splendid vanity she was like some piece of elaborate golden fretwork from which the substance has been refined by excess of workmanship. The voice of criticism was one voice. There arose a unanimous hymn of praise from every literary organ in the country. It was Mr. Langley Wyndham's masterpiece, a work that left the excellence of London Legends far behind it on a lower plane. Though there was no falling off in point of style, the author had found something better to do this time than to cultivate the flowers of perfect speech. Laura was a triumph of intimate characterization, and the brutal touches that disfigured his former work were absent from this. He had shown us that the boldest, most inflexible realism is compatible with a delicacy worthy of the daintiest of esoteric ideals. The book, dedicated "To My Wife," appeared early in October. By November the question of the sources was opened out, and it began to be whispered a whisper that could be traced to the private utterances of Miss Gladys Armstrong that the prototype of Laura was a Miss Audrey Craven. In the person of her ubiquitous double, Miss Audrey Craven became a leading figure in London society. Then bit by bit the news got into the papers, and Wyndham's succès d'estime was followed by succès de scandale, which promised to treble his editions. Thus Audrey, unable to achieve greatness, had greatness thrust upon her, and the weight of it bowed her to the earth. The earth? As she read on, the earth seemed to crumble away from under her feet, leaving her baseless and alone before that terrifying apocalypse. Wyndham had trained her intelligence till it could appreciate the force of every chapter in his book of revelations. At last she saw herself as she was. And yet, could that be she? That mixture of vanity, stupidity, and passion? To be sure, he had been careful to give her brown hair instead of tell-tale red, and skilfully to alter the plot of her life with all details of time and place. But what had he said? Light as air, fluent as water, a being mingled of fire and a little earth, fickle as the wind that blew her in a wavering line across the surface of things, modern, and of stuff so fine that it chafed under the very breath of disapproval, and yet with a little malleable heart in it compounded of the most primeval of affections. She turned over the pages; everywhere she came upon the same thing. Now the phrases were spun out fine, they were subtle, they seemed to cling round her and stifle her. Now they were short and keen, and they cut like knives. Women may be divided into three classes: the virtuous, the flirtuous, and the non virtuous. The middle class is by far the largest. It shades off finely into the two extremes. Laura belonged to it. The moon was up, and Diana, divine sportswoman, was abroad hunting big game. Laura had made a virtue of necessity. She said that proved the necessity of virtue. Oh, the cruelty of it! Would Ted, would Vincent have done this if they had had it in their power? True, they had reproached her, but it was to her face, alone in her own drawing room, where she had a chance of defending herself. They would not have held her up to public scorn, and they had some right to blame her. She saw that now. But what had she done to deserve this from Langley? How had he found it in his heart to speak against her? She had loved him. Yes, she had known many a passing pain, but she had never really suffered until now. That was a part of her education that had been neglected hitherto. Only an accomplished student of human nature could have coached her through the highest branches of it. Having set the scandal successfully afloat, the society papers began to utter a feeble protest against it, thus increasing their own reputation for a refined morality. But they had no power to turn the tide, and the scandal floated on. In society itself judgment was divided. Whether Laura was or was not a work of the highest art was a question you might have heard discussed at every other dinner table. Perhaps the criticism that was most to the point was that of Miss Gladys Armstrong, who proclaimed publicly that Langley Wyndham laboured under the disadvantage of not being a woman, and having no imagination to make up for it. Meanwhile the tone of the larger reviews remained unchanged. The reviewers, to a man, had committed themselves to the position that the book was Wyndham's masterpiece, and nobody could be found to go back on that opinion. But in all that concert of adulation one voice was silent, the only voice that Wyndham cared to hear, that of Percival Knowles. The others might howl in chorus, and it would not be worth his while even to listen. He was looking forward to Knowles' long, impressive solo. But that solo never came, neither could the note of Knowles be detected in the intricate chorus. It was strange. Knowles had been the high priest of the new Wyndham worship, and to him the eminent novelist had looked for sympathy and appreciation. But Knowles had made no sign. They had avoided the subject whenever they met. Wyndham was not so hardened by authorship as to have lost the instinctive delicacy felt by the creator at the birth of his book. Knowles seemed only too much inclined to respect that delicacy. Finally, Wyndham resolved to go and see his friend alone, and tentatively sound him on the subject of Laura. He proposed to himself a pleasant evening's chat, in which that lady would be discussed in all her bearings, and he would enjoy a foretaste of the praise, ere long to be dealt out to him before an admiring public. On his way to Knowles's rooms he heard in fancy the congratulation, the temperate flattery, the fine discriminating phrase. He found Knowles amusing himself with a blue pencil and Miss Armstrong's last novel. Laura, an idyll of Piccadilly, lay on the table beside him, its pages cut, but with none of those slips of paper between them which mark the other books put aside for review. Knowles greeted his friend with an embarrassed laugh, and they fell to discussing every question of the hour except the burning one for Wyndham. By the rapidity of his conversational manoeuvres, it was evident that the critic wanted to steer clear of that topic. Wyndham, however, after ambling round and round it for some time with no effect, suddenly brought up straight in front of it with "By the by, have you condescended to read my last fairy tale?" "What, the Mayfairy tale?" said Knowles, with deft pleasantry. "Yes, of course I've read it." "What do you think of it?" Knowles suddenly looked grave. "Well, at the moment I had much rather not tell you." "Really? Well, I suppose I shall know some day." Knowles looked as if he were struggling with an unpleasant duty, and it were getting the better of him. "Not from me, I'm afraid. It will be the first work of yours I have left unnoticed. As I can't review it favourably, I prefer not to notice it at all." "You surely don't suppose that I came here to fish for a review?" "I do not." "Thanks. I don't deny that I should have appreciated the public expression of your opinion, favourable or unfavourable, but I respect your scruples as far as I understand them. The only thing is " He paused. It was his turn to feel uncomfortable. "Is what?" "Well, after the way you've delivered yourself on my other books, which are feebleness itself compared with this one, I must say your present attitude astonishes me." "I've given you my reasons for it." "No, that's what you've not done. Surely we've known each other too long for this foolishness. Of course it's considerate of you not to damn me for the entertainment of the British public, but you know you're the only man in England whose judgment I care about. And I confess I'd like to have your private opinion. The usual honest and candid thing, you know. I'm not talking of gods, men, and columns." Knowles sat silent, frowning. "Oh well, of course, if you'd rather not, there's nothing more to be said." "Not much." But Wyndham's palpitating egoism was martyred by this silence beyond endurance, and he burst out in spite of himself. "But it's inconceivable to me after the way you've treated my first crude work. You must have set up some new canons of art since then. Otherwise I should say you were inconsistent." But Knowles was not to be drawn out if he could possibly help it. "Do you mind telling me one thing? Have you anything to say against its form?" "Not a word. I admit that in form it's about as perfect as it well could be. He was beginning to feel that he could not help it. "I object to your use of your matter." "What on earth do you mean?" "I mean what I say." "Please explain." "Very well. Since you so earnestly desire my honest and candid opinion, you shall have it. You remind me that I praised your earlier work, and suggest my inconsistency in not approving of your latest. My praise was sincere. I thought, and I have never changed my opinion, that the originality of your first books amounted to genius. Your last, however great its other qualities, has not that merit. It is, I think, conspicuously destitute of imagination." "Do you deny its vitality, its faithfulness to nature?" "Certainly not. I object to it as a barefaced plagiarism from nature." "Then at least you'll admit that my heroine lives?" "She does, unfortunately. Wouldn't it have been better taste to wait till she was decently dead?" "Oh, I see. You mean that." "Yes, I mean that. If you had no respect for your own reputation, you might have thought of Miss Craven's." "Excuse me, this is simply irrelevant nonsense, and most unworthy of you. Miss Craven, as you perfectly well know, is one manifestation of the eternal flirt. I seized on the type she belongs to and individualized it." "You did nothing of the sort. You seized on the individual and put her into type, a very different thing. Do you imagine that life will ever be the same to that poor woman again? I never liked Miss Craven, but she was harmless, even nice, before you got hold of her and spoilt her, by making her think herself clever. Isn't that what happens to Laura?" "That, among other things." "Other things also slavishly copied from Miss Craven. I recognize the faithfulness of your portraiture in all its details, so does she and everybody else." "Knowles, you talk like the lay fool. Surely you know how all fiction worthy of the name is made. I took what lay nearest at hand, as hundreds of novelists have done before me; though as for that, there's not an incident in the book that is not the purest fiction. You don't give me credit. I won't say for originality, but for ordinary reconstructive ability." "I give you credit for having made the most of quite exceptional advantages. You best know how you obtain them." Wyndham reflected a moment, then looked Knowles in the face. "I assure you solemnly there was never any question of Miss Craven's honour." Knowles raised his eyebrows. "I didn't suppose for a moment there was. How about your own, though? Your notions of honour strike me as being quaintly original, rather more original than your Piccadyllic heroine." Knowles was not bad tempered, but he was a frequent cause of bad temper in other people. It was with the utmost difficulty that Wyndham controlled himself for a final effort to evade the personal, and set the question at large on general grounds. "Then I suppose you would deny the right of any artist to make use of living material?" Knowles yawned. "I don't attempt to deny anything. I'm debating another question." "What is that?" Wyndham smiled an uneasy, muscular smile. "Whether it isn't my duty to kick you, or rather to try to kick you, out of this room." "Really? And what for? For the crime of writing a successful story?" "For the perpetration of the most consummate piece of literary scoundrelism on record." As that statement was accompanied by a nervous twitching of the lips, which Wyndham was at liberty to take for a smile, he held out his hand to Knowles before saying good night. "My dear Knowles, if your notions of literary honour held good, there would be an end of realism." "The end of realism, my dear Wyndham, is the thing of all others I most desire to see." They had shaken hands, but Wyndham understood his friend, and he knew as certainly as if Knowles had told him so, that Audrey Craven, the woman whom neither of them loved, had avenged herself. She had struck, through Laura, at the friendship of his life. He was also informed of one or two facts about himself which had not as yet come within the range of his observation. He consoled himself with the reflection that the temptations of genius are not those of other men, and perhaps he was right. Knowles sat down to his review of Miss Armstrong's book with unruffled urbanity. He wrote: "This authoress belongs to a select but rapidly increasing band of thinkers. There may be schisms in the new school with regard to details, but on the whole it is a united one. The members are unanimous in their fearless optimism. One and all they preach the same hopeful doctrine, that the attainment of a high standard of immodesty by woman will in time make morality possible for man." He went to bed vowing that of all professions that chosen by the man of letters is the most detestable. Chapter 22.
Of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 22. That winter was a hard one for the Havilands. They were at the very lowest ebb of their resources, short of being actually in debt. The reclaiming of Hardy had been an expensive undertaking for Katherine in more ways than one. And naturally the more successful her efforts were, the more time they consumed. She had been so busy all summer finishing off old work that she had not been able to take up anything fresh. She had even been obliged to send away sitters, and they had betaken themselves elsewhere. The Witch had not sold, though she had won a big paragraph all to herself in Modern Art.
In her first enthusiasm over Ted's success, Katherine had encouraged him to give up his pot boilers. She had taken over some of his black and white work herself. And in the midst of it all she was engaged on a portrait of Vincent. They were so dependent on what they earned that these serious interruptions to work threatened an inroad on their small capital. Now, they might any day have applied to Mr. Pigott for a loan, and rejoiced that worthy gentleman's heart. But such a step was the last indignity, not even to be contemplated by Ted and Katherine. And even if their pride had not stood in their way, that source of revenue seemed closed to them now. Ted and his uncle had had an unfortunate encounter in the New Gallery. The fact that he was indebted to Katherine for an invitation to the private view had not prevented Mr. Pigott from speaking his mind freely to her brother on the subject of the witch. He said he could have forgiven Ted for painting such a picture. He could have forgiven Katherine too, if it had not been for her ability that made her doubly responsible. Ted tried to soothe him. He led him gently away from the spot. He promised to do all he could to induce Katherine to cultivate the grace of stupidity. But it was useless. The old gentleman stood to his ground, and Ted left him there. He received a letter from him the next morning. "Dear Edward, I parted from you yesterday more in sorrow than in anger. I need not tell you how deeply shocked and grieved I was to learn from a literary young friend that the subject of your sister's picture is taken from the works of the atheist Shelley, a man whose unprincipled life, I am told, is an all sufficient commentary on his opinions. Your cousin Nettie is earning a modest competence by poker work, and the painting of flowers, birds, and other innocent and beautiful objects. Why cannot Katherine do the same? When she is willing to give up her present pursuits for some becoming occupation, let her be assured of my ready encouragement and help. Till then, no more. From your affectionate uncle, James Pigott." Mr. Pigott had written his last sentence advisedly. "Some day," he said to himself, "those young people will have to put their pride in their pocket." He might have known that the Haviland pride was not of the kind that goes conveniently into any pocket, even an empty one. But Katherine worked her hardest, and gave little heed to these things. She saw her own chances of success dwindling farther into the distance, and was surprised to see how little she cared, for a curious callousness had come over her of late. Selfish ambition, selfish because it often persists in living when all other things are dead, seemed to have died in her at last. Had she overcome it, or was it that she had really ceased to care? She had too much to think of to be able to settle that question just now. After all, she had another source of pride. Vincent had begun by looking to her as a protection against his worst self, and when his mother died suddenly that winter, his last link with home being broken, he became more and more dependent on Katherine. And now, though the tie of comradeship between them was closer than ever, he had no longer any need of her. He could go alone. His will was free, his intellect was awake. He read hard now. All his old ardours and enthusiasms returned to him. He worked on the Pioneer book, recasting his favourite parts, beating the whole into shape, and hunting down the superfluous adjective with a manly delight in the new sport. Katherine had shown the revised manuscript to Knowles, and he had found her a publisher and worked him into the right frame of mind. Katherine had suppressed part of that publisher's verdict. It was to the effect that though the text was up to the average merit of its kind, the illustrations would form the most valuable portion of the work. Hardy had submitted the final revision of his proofs to Katherine, but on one point he was resolute. "I want the dedication to stand as it is, Sis." And Katherine nodded her head and was silent. He often talked about Audrey now. He was no longer bitter and vindictive as he had been in the days of his degradation. His old feeling for her had returned to him, unchanged except for the refining process he himself had undergone. His love was ennobled now by an infinite pity. Not that he had lost sight of what she had done for him, but now that his eyes were clearer he saw her as she was, and felt to the full the pathos of her vanity. Wyndham's book was severely criticised in Devon Street. One day, about 4 months after its appearance, Hardy had returned to the subject nearest his heart, and was discussing it with Katherine as he sat to her for his portrait, now nearly finished. He had just pleasantly told her that he wished he had managed to fall in love with her instead of with Audrey. She would have made something very different of him. a remark to which Katherine made no answer, treating it, as Hardy thought, with the contempt it deserved. Then he broke out, as he had done many a time before. "I don't know how it is. When I was away from her I used to think of her as a sort of amateur angel leading me on." Katherine smiled. It was very evident that Audrey had led him on. "When I was with her she seemed to be a little devil, encouraging everything that was bad in me. I don't know how she did it, but she did. And yet, Kathy, whatever they may say, I don't believe she's bad. I don't swear, of course, that she's a paragon of goodness." "Isn't there a medium?" "But she was a sweet little thing before she met that scoundrel Wyndham, wasn't she?" But Katherine was giving the whole of her attention to Vincent's nose. "Putting Audrey out of the question, I don't think much of Mr. Langley Wyndham. I don't like his books. I can't breathe in his stuffy drawing rooms. Why can't the fellow open his windows sometimes and let in a little of God's fresh air? As you know, I believe he's even a shadier character than I am." "He hasn't got a character. It's all run to literature." "H'm. I'm not so sure about that." Katherine had laid down her brushes and was examining her work with her head on one side. "Well, he can't draw a character anyhow. Laura's simply impossible." "I don't know. Laura is Audrey, and Audrey's a funny person." "I used to think that Audrey wasn't a person, that she was made up of little bits of people stuck together." "That's not bad, Sis. She is made up of bits of people stuck together." "Yes, but the thing is, what makes them stick? Mr. Wyndham doesn't go into that, and that's Audrey. His work is clever, too clever by half, but it's terribly superficial." Hardy meditated on that saying, then he began again. "You've done a great deal for me, Kathy. I sometimes think that if you'd given your mind to it, you could have made something of Audrey. You know, poor little thing, she used to think she was very strong minded. But she was more easily twisted about than any woman I know. That's what made her so fickle. If there's any truth in that stupid story of Wyndham's, she must have been like a piece of putty in her hands. I believe if you could have got hold of her, you could have done her some good." "I don't believe in doing people good." "I do. I'm a case in point." "No, you're not." "I am. You did me good." "I'm very glad to hear it. If I did, it's because I never thought about it. Now, if I tried my hand on Audrey, I should set to work with the fixed intention of doing her good, therefore I should fail miserably. It's a different thing altogether." "I see no difference myself." Katherine was silent. Her charity had covered the multitude of Vincent's sins. Why had she not been able to spare a corner of it for Audrey's? "Come," said Hardy, "it's not as if she was really very bad." "No, it's not. There'd be some chance then. There is a medium, and the medium is hopeless. The wonder is you never found that out." "I did. I knew it all the time, yet I loved her. It made no difference. Nothing ever will. I've tried to kill my feeling for her, but it's no use. I can't. I should have to kill myself first, and even then I believe I should find it waiting for me in Hades when I got there." "After all, why should you try to kill it, Vincent?" "It's the shame of it, Sis." Katherine might have thought that on the contrary he seemed rather proud of the permanence of his affections, but she was too much preoccupied to be aware of his moral absurdity. "Well, I don't know much about these things, but it seems to me that even if she doesn't love you, even if she isn't everything you thought she was, there's no reason to be ashamed of loving her." "Ah, Kathy, you never loved any one like that." Her colour changed. "No, it isn't every one who can love like that." "What would you do if you were in my case, if you'd given yourself away like me? Supposing you went and lost your little heart to some man fiend who was, we'll say, about as bad a lot as I am, and who had the execrable taste not to care a rap for you. Wouldn't you feel ashamed of him and yourself too?" Katherine's white face flushed. She looked away from him and answered steadily, "No, I wouldn't." He thought he had hurt her feelings, and was about to change the subject when she turned a beaming face to him. "But then, you see, I don't love anything much." "Good as you are, you'd be a better woman if you did." "Of course there are exceptions. I've some sort of affection for the Witch and Ted." "Ted is a very fine boy, and the Witch is a very fine picture, but well, some day you'll have an affection for something else. It won't be a boy, and it won't be a picture. Then, Sis, you'll know what it is to feel, and your art will go pop." "Oh, I hope not. But it's not true. Look at Ted." "Ted's a man and you are a woman. 10 to 1 a really great passion improves a man's art. It plays the deuce with a woman's." "I don't believe it," said Katherine, with rather more warmth than the occasion demanded. Shall I tell you what you've been doing, Sis? First of all, you've tried to live two lives and get the best out of each. That was tempting Providence, as Mrs. Rogers would say. You found that wouldn't work, so you said to yourself, I give it up. Here goes. I'll be a woman at all costs. I'll know what it is to love. Katherine took up her brushes again, and in spite of herself moved one foot impatiently. Hardy went on, well pleased with his own lucidity. And you gave up the only thing you really cared about, and played at being the slave of duty, the devoted sister. She sighed. Was it a sigh of relief? You're wrong. I'm anything but a devoted sister. Yes, you're anything but a devoted sister. I'm going to claim one of the privileges of friendship, that of speaking unpleasant truths in the unpleasantest way possible. Go on, this is getting interesting. I repeat then, you're not a truly devoted sister. A truly devoted sister would give her brother a chance of developing some moral fibre on his own account. Ever since you two lived together you've been making noble sacrifices. Now two can't play at that game, and the boy hasn't had a chance. The consequence is he won't work. He prefers taking it easy. That was Audrey's fault, not mine. Yes, but you encouraged him, and now he does what he likes, young monkey, and you do all the pot boilers. And you're making yourself ill over them. So much for Ted. I've given him a hint, and he took it very well. Now for the witch. I believe in your heart of hearts you love her better than everybody else put together. And now you're off on the other tack. You're trying to sit on the artist in you that you may develop the woman. I mean the other way about. You're sitting on the woman that you may develop the artist. Aren't you getting a little mixed? That plan works worse than all. Let me implore you not to go on with it. If you only knew it, there's nothing that you will ever do that's lovelier than your own womanhood. Whatever you do, don't kill that. Don't go on hardening your heart to everything human till there's no sweetness left in your nature, Kathy. I want my little sister to make the best of her life. Some day some good man will ask you to be his wife. If, when that day comes, you don't know how to live, little woman, all the success in the world won't make up to you for the happiness you have missed. Oh, Vincent, if you only knew how funny you are! She laughed the laugh that Vincent loved to hear, and when she looked at him her eyelashes were all wet with it. All right, Sis. Some day you'll own that your elder brother wasn't such a fool as you think him. I I don't think you a fool. I only wish you knew how frightfully funny you are. No, I don't though," she added below her breath. But Vincent was quite unable to see wherein lay the humour of his excellent remarks. He considered that his experience gave him a right to speak with authority on questions of feeling, but it had not made him understand everything. The next morning Katherine was sitting before her easel, waiting for Vincent to come up for the last sitting. It was a raw, cold day, and her fingers felt numbed as they took up the brushes. Ted had made a promise to Hardy to do his fair share of the more remunerative work. Before keeping it he was giving a few final touches to one of the figures in his Dante study of Paulo and Francesca, swept like leaves on the wind of hell. He was in high good humour, and as he worked he talked incessantly, quoting from an imaginary review. In the genius of Mr. Edward Haviland we have a new avatar of the spirit of art. Mr. Haviland is the disciple of no school. He owes no debt either to the past or to the present. He works in a noble freedom from prejudice and preconception, uncorrupted by custom as he is untrammeled by tradition. If we may classify what is above and beyond classification, we should say that in matter Mr. Haviland is an idealist, while in form he is an ultra-realist. We dare to prophesy that he will become the founder of a new romantico-classical school in the near future. Oh, Ted, do be quiet and let me think for a minute. Oh, what's the matter, Kathy? I don't know. I think I'm tired, or else it's the cold. Ted looked at her earnestly for him, and then came over to her and stroked her hair. There's something wrong. Won't you confide in your brother? I'm all right, only lazy. Can't can't I do anything? Well, perhaps. I don't want you to give up much of your time to it. But if you'd finish some of those black and white things, I don't feel equal to tackling them all single handed. "Oh," said the boy, turning very red, "why didn't you say so before?" He sat down and began at once on the pile of manuscripts waiting to be illustrated. But he continued to talk. "I saw Vincent the other day, and he told me his opinion of you pretty plainly." "What did he say?" "Why, that you've sacrificed your poor brother to your desire to cut a moral figure. that you've been cultivating all sorts of extravagant virtues at my expense. I might have been playing the most heroic parts and getting any amount of applause if you hadn't selfishly bagged all the best ones for yourself. You've taken up the whole of the stage, so that I haven't had room even to exercise the minor virtues. Just reach me that sheaf of crayons, there's a good girl. Thanks." Ted put on a judicial air and chose a crayon. "Look, there. You've taken the most uncomfortable chair and the worst light in the studio, when I might have been posing in them all the time. I haven't had half a chance. Vincent said so. No wonder he's disgusted with you." "Ah, that's not so bad for a mere tyro." "No, Kathy, he's quite right. You're an angel, and I've been a lazy scoundrel. But you'll admit that during my painful mental affliction I wasn't quite responsible. And afterwards, well, how was I to know? I thought we were getting on very nicely." "So we were, Ted, up till now." Her last words were so charged with feeling that Ted looked up surprised. But he said nothing, being a person of tact. The sitting that morning was not a long one. Hardy seemed tired and depressed. After posing patiently for half an hour, he gave it up. "It's no good this morning. I must go out and get a little warmth into me. You people had better come too." "Such a horrid day," pleaded Katherine. "You'll get exceedingly wet and come back no warmer. It's going to rain or snow or something." As she spoke, the first drops of a cold sleet rattled on the skylight. But Vincent was obstinate and restless. "I must go if it's only for a turn on the Embankment. What with my book and your picture, I haven't stretched my legs all week. Come along, Ted. You'll die, Kathy, if you persist in wallowing in oil paint like that, and taking no exercise." They set out before a cutting north easter, and a sharp shower of rain that froze as it fell. Katherine watched them as they crossed the street and turned on to the Embankment. The wind came round the corner as a north easter will, and through the window sash, chilling her as she stood. "There's nobody more surprised than myself," she said, "and yet I might have known that if I went in for this sort of thing I should make a mess of it." She went back to the fire and settled herself in the attitude of thought. There was no end to her thinking now. Perhaps that was the reason why she was always tired. Hitherto she had triumphed over fatigue and privation by a power which seemed inexhaustible and was certainly mysterious. Much of it was due to sheer youth and health, and to the exercise which gave her a steady hand and a cool head; much, doubtless, to her unflinching will. But Katherine was hardly aware how far her strength had lain in the absence of temptation to any feminine weakness. Hitherto she had seen her object always in a clear untroubled air, and her work had gained something of her life's austere and passionless serenity. Now it was all different, and she was thinking of what had made that difference. Ted came back glowing from his walk, but Vincent was colder than ever. He sat shivering over the Havilands' fire all afternoon, and went to bed early. "We'll finish that sitting to morrow, Sis," he said wearily. Ted went out again to dine with Knowles, and Katherine was left alone. It might have been her own mood, or the shadow of Vincent's, but she was depressed with vague presentiments of trouble. They gathered like the formless winter clouds, without falling in any rain. Then she realized that she was very tired. She wrapped herself in a rug and lay down on the couch to rest. And rest came as it comes after a sleepless night, not in sleep deep and restorative, but in a gentle numbing of the brain. She woke out of her stupor refreshed. The cloud had rolled away, and she could work again. She sat down to the last pile of Vincent's proofs. When she had finished them, she turned over the pages again. The reading had brought back to her the last 18 months, with all the meaning that they had for her now. She looked back and thought of the years when she had first worked for Ted, of the precious time that Audrey had wasted. The fatalism that was her mood so often now told her that these things had to be. And it was better, infinitely better, for Ted to have had that experience. She looked back on the year that Vincent had wasted out of his own life, and saw that that too had to be. There had been vicarious salvation even there. Ted had once told her that there was a time when, as he expressed it, he would have walked calmly to perdition, if Vincent had not gone before him and shown him what was there. She looked back on that year of her own life, wasted, as she had once thought, the year she had given up so grudgingly at the beginning, so freely at the end, and she was content. And now she was giving up not time alone and thought and labour, but love, love that could have no certain reward but pain, and she was still content. At first she had been astonished and indignant at her own capacity for emotion. It was as if her nature had suddenly revealed itself in a new and unpleasant light. Then she had grown accustomed to it. Yesterday she was even amused at the strangeness and the fatuity of it all. She described herself as a bungling amateur, wandering out of her own line and attempting the impossible. Clearly she should have left this sort of thing to people like Audrey, to whose genius it was suited, and who might hope to attain some success in it. But for her the love of art was quite incompatible with the art of love. She could have imagined herself entertaining these feelings for some one like Percival Knowles, for instance, who was clever and had an educated sense of humour, who wrote verses for her and flattered her artistic vanity. But to have fixed upon Vincent, of all people in the world! She must have done it because it was impossible. That was what she had said yesterday, but to day she understood. Had she not helped to make Vincent a man that she could love without shame? He was the work of her hands, that which her own fingers had made. It was natural that she should love her own work. Was she not an artist before everything, as he had said? Her tears came, and after her tears a calm, in which she heard the beating of a heart that was not her own, and felt the pulse of the divine fate that moves through human things. Then she asked herself, was Vincent right? What effect had this curious experience really had on her painting? She felt no personal interest in the answer, but she got up and went to the easel. Her portrait of Vincent was finished, all but the right hand that was still in outline. It was strange. Ted's best work had begun with his head of Audrey. What about her own? She saw through her tears that in all her long and hateful apprenticeship to portrait painting, nothing that she had ever done could compare with this last. There was a new quality in it, something that she had once despaired of attaining, and that was character. She had painted the man himself as she saw him. Not the Vincent of any particular hour, but Vincent with the memory of the past and the hope of the future in his face. All the infinite suggestion and pathos, the complex expression that life had left on it, was there. If she had not loved Vincent, loved him not only as he was, but as he might have been, would she have known how to paint like that? Although her womanhood would never receive the full reward of its devotion, that debt had been paid back to her art with interest. The artistic voice told her that Vincent was wrong, that for her what women call love had meant knowledge, that her strength would henceforth lie in the visible rendering of character, and that work of such a high order would command immediate success. And the voice of her womanhood cried out in anguish, "All the success in the world won't make up to you for the happiness you have missed." There was no sitting the next day, for Vincent was in bed, ill, with congestion of the lungs. End of chapter 22. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 23 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 23. There is a little village in North Devon, sheltered from the sea by a low range of sand hills that stretches for miles on each side of it. The coast turns westward here, and no cliff breaks that line of billowy sand; northward and southward it goes, with the rhythmic monotony of the sea. The sand hills are dotted with tufts of the long star grass, where the rabbits sit; inland they are covered with fine blades bitten short by the sheep. Seaward lies the hard, ribbed sand, glistening with salt, and fringed with white surf of the Atlantic. On the coast, about a mile from the village, there is a long one storied bungalow built on the sand hills. The sand is in the garden, where no flowers grow but sea pinks and the wild horn poppy. It lies in drifts about the veranda, and is whirled by the Atlantic storms onto the low thatched roof. The house stands alone, but for a few fishermen's huts beside it, huddled close together for neighbourhood. Here, because it was the most man forsaken spot she knew, Audrey had come, exchanging the roar of London for the roar of the Atlantic. She thought she would find consolation in the presence of nature. London had become intolerable to her. Everywhere she turned she was reminded of the hateful Laura. Laura stood open in the window of every bookshop. Laura lay on every drawing room table. There was no getting away from her. And yet Audrey's notoriety had won her more friends than she had ever had before. Everywhere people were kind to her. They made much of her. They said it was hard lines, it was a shame, execrable, unpardonable, and they assured her that nobody thought a bit the worse of her for all that. Some even went so far as to declare that they saw not the remotest resemblance between her and the popular heroine. But it was no use. Nothing could raise her in her own esteem. She fled. She longed to be alone with nature. She took the bungalow for the winter, and once there she wished she had never come. She arrived in a storm that lasted some days. She thought she would have gone mad simply with hearing the mad wind and sea. It was the same whether she sat indoors listening to them, or she walked out battling with the wreaths of whirling sand. After the storm came the dull, grey, heaving calm, always the rolling clouds, the rolling sandhills, and the rolling sea. That was infinitely worse. And to add to her depression, Audrey had never been so rigidly confined to the society of her chaperon. There was nobody else to see or hear, and the boundaries of the poor lady's intellect were conspicuous in the melancholy waste. There was no escape from her except into the cold monotony without. Then February set in warm, though grey. One morning Audrey was able to sit out on a sunny hollow of the sandhills, where the rabbits had flattened a nest for her. Then she could think. She was in the presence of nature. Art was nothing to this. Art, in the time of her brief acquaintance with it, had baffled her and given her a hint of her own feebleness. But nature was the great incomprehensible, and she was alone with it. Alone in a lonely land, peopled mostly by the wild creatures of sea and shore, by peasants and fishermen, men and women who looked at her with strange eyes and spoke a strange language, whose ways were dark to her, and their thoughts unfathomable. She was face to face not only with primitive human beings, but with the primeval forces of the world, the stern, implacable will of the wind and sea. Not that she could feel these things thus, for they lay beyond the range of her emotions; but at the same time they tortured her. At first it was only by a dull sense of their presence, annihilating her own. Then, because they were things too great for her to grasp, they cruelly flung her back upon herself. They had no revelation for her. But left to herself, bit by bit her own character was revealed to her. Not as it had appeared to her before, not even as Wyndham had revealed it to her, but in the nothingness that was its being. It was stripped bare of all that had clothed it and ruled it, and made it seem beautiful in her eyes. Left to herself, all the influences that had lent colour and consistency to this blank unstable nature had passed out of her life. The men whose destiny she had tried to mould, who had ended by moulding hers, twisting it now into one shape, now into another, had done with it at last. They had flung it from them, unshapen as before. There was no permanence even in destiny. Vincent, whose will had dominated her own; Ted, whose boyish passion had touched her heart and made her feel; Langley, whose intellect had kindled hers and made her able to think, they were all gone, and she was alone. That was Langley's doing. Langley, whom alone of the three she had really loved. Ah, she hated him for it now. And hating him, she remembered the many virtues of the two whom she had not loved well. Vincent, that was a revelation of love. Why had she shut her eyes to it? Ted too, poor boy, he might have been hers still if she had chosen. She might have been moulding his destiny at this moment, instead of which his destiny was doubtless moulding itself admirably without her. Then her mood changed. She revolted against the cruelty of her lot. Her sex was the original, the unpardonable injustice. If she had only been a man, she could have taken her life into her own hands and shaped it according to her will. But woman, even modern woman, is the slave of circumstances and the fool of fate. "Audrey, Audrey, my dear," called a wind blown voice across the sandhills. Solitude had frightened Miss Craven out of the bungalow, and she was picking her way in and out among the rabbit holes. North Devon was hateful to Cousin Bella. She hated the wastes of sand and sea, the discomforts of the bungalow, the slow hours uncertainly measured by meal times that seemed as if they would never come. Her brain was wild with unsatisfied curiosity. Yet she had tact in the presence of real suffering. She had forborne to question Audrey about the past, and their present life was not fruitful in topics. She did nothing but wonder. "I wonder when it will be tea time. I wonder if there was anything between Audrey and her cousin. I wonder which of those three gentlemen it was. I wonder when it will be tea time." That was the monotonous rondo of her thoughts, to which the sea kept time. "Audrey, my dear, come in. I think it must be lunch time," she wailed. But no answer came from the hollow. She meekly turned and picked her way back again across the sandhills. Audrey lay hidden till the forlorn little figure was out of sight. Then she got up and looked around her. She shuddered. Her life was as bleak as the bleak landscape smitten by the salt wind, cold and grey and formless as the winter sea. What was that black silhouette on the sands? She strained her eyes to see. Another figure was making its way towards her from the bungalow. When it came near she recognized the unofficial rustic who brought telegrams from the nearest post town. She waited. The man approached her with an inane smile on his face. "Telegram for you, Miz," he drawled. She tore open the cover and read, "Come at once. Vincent dying. Wire what train you come by. Katherine." She crumpled the paper in her clenched hand. The landscape was blotted out. She saw nothing but the envelope lying at her feet, a dull orange patch against the greyish sand. "Any answer, Miz?" No. She shut her eyes and tried to realise it. "Yes, yes, there is. Wait, I must look out my trains first." She made out that by driving to Barnstaple and catching the 2 o'clock train she would reach Waterloo about 8. She sent the man back with a telegram saying that she would be in Devon Street by 9 that evening at the latest. It was past 1 then, and she had yet to pack. It was hopeless, she could never catch that train. It did not matter, there was another to Paddington an hour later. It was a slow train, but she would be with Vincent by 11. But she was Fate, and had to have some luncheon before she could do anything, and there was so much to do. She flew hither and thither, trying to collect her clothes and her thoughts. Her grey cloak and her bearskins, she would want them, it would be cold in the train. And her best hat, where was her best hat? Cousin Bella had hidden her best hat. Ah, she must think, or everything would go wrong. What was it all about? Vincent dying? Dying? Audrey knew little about dying, except that it was a habit people had of plunging you suddenly into mourning when you had just ordered a new dress. Death was another of those things she could not understand. By the time she had had luncheon and decided what clothes she would take and packed them, by the time the one old fly in the village had been ordered and had made its way at a funereal pace to Barnstaple, Audrey was just in time to see the 3 o'clock train steaming out of the station. By taking the next train, and travelling all night, she would only reach Paddington at 4 in the morning. As she was at last borne on towards London, lying back on the cushions and trying to sleep, the facts became more clear to her. Vincent was dying, and he had sent for her. She was exalted once more in her own eyes. It seemed to her then that her love for Vincent had been the one stable and enduring thing in her nature, the link that bound her to a transfigured past, that gave coherence to a life of episodes. End of chapter 23. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Chapter 24 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 24. Vincent had been ill for 6 weeks before Katherine sent off her telegram. For a month of that time he had been struggling with death. Then, when the mild weather set in, he had taken a sudden turn for the better, and it seemed to himself and the Havilands that he had won the victory. Only the doctor and Mrs. Rogers looked grave, the doctor because of his science, which taught him to be cautious in raising people's hopes; Mrs. Rogers because of a deep theological pessimism. She unburdened herself to Katherine. "I knew how it 'ud be when he gave up them habits of his, miss. He's been as good as gold for the last year. He ain't given me no trouble nor anybody, a goin' about so soft, and boilin' of his coffee in his little Etna. I said to myself then, 'He's goin' to be took.' It was the same with my poor husband, miss." "Don't talk nonsense, Mrs. Rogers. Mr. Hardy hasn't the least intention of dying.
He's getting better as fast as ever he can." "Oh, miss, don't you say so. Gives me a turn to 'ear anybody talk so presumptuous. Don't you do it, ma'am. If he's a little better, it's enough to make the Almighty take him, just to hear you, miss." Katherine forgave Mrs. Rogers, for the affectionate woman had helped to nurse Vincent with a zeal out of all proportion to her knowledge. Katherine had engaged a night nurse during the crisis of his illness. After that she and Ted nursed him themselves by turns, one sitting up all night, while the other slept on a bed made up in the sitting room, to be within call. Katherine learned to know Ted better in those 6 weeks than in all his life before. The boy seemed to be possessed by a passion of remorse. He was as quiet as Katherine in Vincent's room, and could do anything that had to be done there with the gentleness and devotion of a woman. She would willingly have kept on the trained nurse, in order to give Vincent every advantage in the fight for recovery, but it was impossible. For all three of them had come to the end of their resources at the same time. The Havilands were in debt at last. Vincent had sunk nearly all his capital in his British Columbian farm, where the agent in whose integrity he had guilelessly trusted worked the land for his own benefit and cheated him out of the returns. His mother had left everything to her second husband. Worse than all was the reprehensible conduct of Sir Theophilus Parker. The old gentleman had died well within the term his nephew had given him, but had made no mention of him in his will, and Lavernac and 3,000 a year went to a kinsman of irreproachable morals, but a Radical, and many degrees more distant than Vincent from the blood of a Tory squire. So, after the struggle with death came the struggle with poverty. Work was impossible for hands busy with service in the sick room, and young brains worn out with watching and anxiety. The most expensive luxuries were poor Vincent's necessities, for everything depended now on keeping up his strength. One morning, after a long night's watching, instead of turning into the next room to sleep, Katherine put on her hat and cloak and went up to the deserted studio. She left the house with the Witch of Atlas under her cloak, and carried her to every picture dealer in Piccadilly and New Bond Street. It was all in vain. Everywhere the witch was pronounced to be beautiful, but unsaleable. She was bowed out of every shop door with polite regret, expressed in one formula: "The demand for this kind of work is really so small that we could only offer you a nominal sum, ma'am." Finally Katherine turned into a small shop in Westminster, only to receive the same answer. But this time she was desperate. "What do you call a nominal sum?" The dealer looked the picture up and down. He noted, too, the shabby cloak and worn face of the artist. "Frame included, 5 guineas. Not a shilling more, miss." "I'll take that," she said, almost greedily, and the witch was handed over the counter in exchange for the 10th part of her value. But 5 guineas were a mere drop in the ocean of their necessities. 2 days later Katherine set out again, no longer alert and eager, but with a white face, a firm mouth, and a bearing so emphatically resolute that it suggested a previous agony of indecision. She took a bus from Lupus Street to the City. Getting out at Leadenhall Street, she walked on till she came to a building where an arrow pointed on the doorway guided her to the offices of Messrs. Pigott & Co. on the 3rd floor. On and on she went, up the broad stone stairs, with a sick heart and trembling knees, the steepest, weariest climb she had ever made in a life of climbing. When she reached the 3rd floor she almost turned back at the sight of the closed door marked "Private." Then the thought of Vincent lying in his wretched room, a sudden blinding vision of his white face laid back on the pillows, overcame the last rebellion of her pride. She knocked. A well regulated voice answered, "Who's there?" She brushed her eyelashes with her hand and walked in. "It's me, uncle." Mr. Pigott almost started from his seat. "You, Katherine? Bless me! Dear me, dear me!" He put on his spectacles and examined her as if she had been some curious animal. And he, too, noticed not only her frayed skirt and the worn edges of the fur about her cloak, but the sharp lines of her face and the black shadows under her eyes. "Sit down, my dear." She obeyed, putting her elbow on the office table and resting her head in her hand. She looked defiantly, almost fiercely before her, and spoke in a cold, hard voice. "I've come to ask you if you'll lend us some money. We're in debt." "In debt? That's bad." "I know it is. But we've had illness in the house, and expenses that we had to meet." "Bless me! Is the boy ill?" "No, it's not Ted. But as she tried to explain who it was, she broke down utterly and burst into tears. Then Uncle James took off his spectacles and wiped them. He waited till she could speak coherently, and when he had heard, he took his cheque book out of his drawer, asking no questions and making no comments, for which Katherine respected him. "How much will clear you, Katherine, and see you to the end of this business?" "£20 would clear us, but—" Uncle James looked very grave, and he wrote with a slow and terrible deliberation. But he smiled lavishly as he handed her a cheque for 100 guineas. He had made it guineas. "Remember, there's plenty more where that came from." "I I don't know how to thank you, uncle. We'll repay it gradually, with the interest." "Interest, indeed! You'll do nothing of the kind. And we won't say anything about repayment either, this time. Only keep out of debt, keep out of debt, and don't make a fool of yourself, Katherine." Katherine hesitated, and her voice trembled. I'm not." "No, I don't say you are. I asked no questions. And Katherine?" He looked up, but she was still standing beside him. "Yes?" "Always come to me at once when you want money, and go to your Aunt Kate when you want advice. She'll help you better than I can, my dear." Thank you very much indeed. You are too good to me." She stooped down and kissed him on the forehead, pressing his hand in hers, and was gone before he could see her tears. Perhaps they would have gratified him. But he was amply rewarded by her kiss and the compliment paid him by his own conscience, which told him that he had not forced his niece's confidence as he might have done, nor yet chuckled as he might have done over her fallen pride. It was a remarkable fulfilment of prophecy too. When she got back to Devon Street, Vincent was asleep, with Mrs. Rogers watching over him, and Ted was waiting for her to come to lunch. He looked terribly depressed. She showed him her cheque in silence. "You never asked him, that stern old Puritan father?" "Don't, Ted." "Yes, I did. I thought it would kill me, but it didn't. Oh, Ted, we have done him an injustice. He was kindness itself. I had to tell him about Vincent too, and he never said a word, only gave me the cheque and said we weren't to pay it back." "H'm. That wasn't half bad of him, poor old thing." That admission meant a great deal from Ted. "There's a letter there for you, from Knowles, I think." "What's he writing about?" She tore open the envelope. To her intense surprise she found a cheque for 50 guineas in it, and this note: "Dear Miss Haviland, forgive my saying so, but when you want to sell your pictures, why don't you consult your friends instead of going to a thieving dealer? I found the witch in the hands of such an one, and rescued her for I won't say how little. As I could not possibly keep my ill gotten gains on any other terms, please accept the enclosed, which with what you probably received will make up something like her real value. I need not tell you how delighted I am to possess so exquisite a specimen of your best work." "Ted, what am I to do? Send it back again?" "No, you little fool, keep it, and never do that again for any one." For any one? What was there that she would not do for Vincent? But Ted, having said that, looked more depressed than ever. He went to the fireplace and leaned against the chimney piece, shading his face with his hand. "What is it, Ted?" He made no answer. A terrible fear clutched at her heart, and he saw it in her eyes. "He's all right now. He's sleeping, but—" "But what? Tell me, Ted." "Well, Crashawe was here this morning, and he says he isn't really better." "But he is better. He said so himself when you examined him yesterday." "Yes, so he is in a way. That is, you see, his lungs are all right. It's his heart that's bad now. Crashawe says it must always have been more or less weak, and now—" He stopped short. "Ted," she implored, "it may stop beating any minute." She said nothing; she only took off her hat and cloak and put on her artist's overall. It was her nurse's apron now. She must go to Vincent, but a thought struck her before she reached the door. "Does he know?" "No, but I think he has some idea. He told Crashawe this morning not to interfere with the course of nature." Ted smiled a dreary smile at the recollection. Katherine dismissed Mrs. Rogers and took up her post at Vincent's bedside. He was still sleeping with his face turned towards her as she sat. And as she looked at him she had hope. She was still young, and it was inconceivable to her that anything she loved so much should die. It was not, she pleaded, as if she had been happy, as if her love had any chance of a return, or had asked for anything better than to spend itself like this continually. And as she sat on watching, it seemed to her that it was better as it was. Better that love should live by immortal things, by things intangible, invisible, by pity, by faith, by hope, breaking little by little every link with earth. She tried to make herself believe this pleasant theory, as she had tried many a day and many a night before, her heart having nothing else to warm it but the fire of its own sacrifice. It was better as it was. And yet, she said again, in this last 6 weeks he had been hers in a way in which he could be no other woman's, not even Audrey's. He was hers by her days of service, her nights of watching, by all that had gone before, by her part in his new life. After all, that could never be undone. She was almost happy. Ted took her place for an hour in the evening, but that was all the rest she gave herself. She meant to sit up with Vincent again to night. "Do you know, Kathy, your eyes are very pretty." It had struck midnight, and Vincent had been awake and looking at her for the last 2 minutes. She smiled and blushed, and that made her whole face look pretty too. And as he looked into her eyes, the blindness fell from his own, and he saw as a dying man sometimes does see. "Come here, Sis." He stretched out his arm on the counterpane, and as she knelt beside him he put back her hair from her forehead. "I wonder if I was wrong when I thought you couldn't love anybody." Then she knew that he was dying. "Yes, very wrong indeed. For I loved you then, Vincent." Her face was transfigured as she spoke. He had to be spared all sudden emotions, but she knew that her confession would do him no harm. And indeed he took it quite calmly, without the least change of pulse. "I'm not ungrateful." "There's nothing to be grateful for. I couldn't help it." "I would have loved you more, Kathy, if it hadn't been for Audrey." He spoke without emotion, in the tone of a man stating a simple matter of fact. Then he remarked in the same matter of fact voice that, as it happened, he was dying, so it made no difference. Perhaps he wanted her to know that a grave was ready for the secret she had just told him. There was no need to remind her of that. She was sure of it before she spoke. Her kneeling attitude and hands outstretched on the counterpane suggested an order of ideas that had never been very far from him during his illness. For Vincent had been wide awake and thinking difficult thoughts many a time when he lay with his eyes closed, and Katherine had thought he was asleep. "I want you to read to me," he said at last. "What would you like?" "Well, the New Testament, I think, if it's all the same to you." She rose from her knees and looked helplessly round the room. There was a Bible somewhere upstairs, but "You'll find one in the drawer there, where my handkerchiefs are." She looked, rummaging gently among his poor things. She came on a small muslin pocket handkerchief, stained with blood; also a loop of black ribbon of the kind that little girls tie their hair with. Some fine reddish hairs were still tangled in the knot. At last she found a small pocket Testament mixed up with some of his neckties. It was old and worn. Katherine wondered at that, though she could hardly have said why. Then she saw, written on the fly leaf in a sprawling girl's hand, "Vincent, with Audrey's best love," and a date that went back to their childhood. It was the only present that Audrey had ever made him, and one that had cost her nothing. What part shall I read? She was afraid that Vincent would lay the burden of choice on her. But he did not. He had very decided ideas of his own. "The 8th of Romans, if you don't mind." An eagle's feather floated out from between the pages at the 8th of Romans. It had been picked up on the snows of the Rocky Mountains. If she had wondered at first, she soon saw why Vincent had chosen that chapter of all others. "Therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live after the flesh. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live." Vincent was dying. She read on, and as she read she saw behind the edges of the veil that divides the seen from the unseen. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. Her heart beat faster and her breast heaved, but the words lifted her above pathos and tears, and prepared her for the consolation of the close. "Do you believe all that?" he asked suddenly, when she had finished. She had not expected that. "I didn't, but I do now." "Why?" His eyes were fixed on hers, scrutinizing, pathetic. "Because I must." That reason seemed to be hardly enough for Vincent. He was still hesitating and uncertain, as if he were looking for something that she could not give him. Then he lay back again with his eyes closed. It was Katherine's turn to think. But Vincent's peace of mind was of more importance to her than the truth or falsehood of a creed. She had realized that there were things that even her love could not do for him. With a sudden flash of recollection she thought of the young priest she had once met at Audrey's house. If any one could help Vincent now, it might be Mr. Flaxman Reed. She was probably mistaken; nobody is very wise between 12 and 1 in the morning, but at least she could try. "Vincent," she whispered, "would you like to see a clergyman?" She smiled, for after all it might be the very last thing that he wanted. He smiled too, a little consciously. His mood had changed for the time being; he had come back again to earth. "No, thank you, Sis. But I should like." "What? Tell me." "To see Audrey." The three words gave her a shock, but they told her nothing new. "You shall. I'll send for her first thing in the morning." He turned round with his face away from her, and settled himself again to sleep. And Katherine watched. He would be Audrey's to morrow. He was hers at least for that one night. No, never, never again. To morrow had come, and the image of Audrey was between them. It always had been there. Was it better so? The next day Audrey had to be found. Ted went to Chelsea Gardens early in the morning, supposing her to be there. The house was shut up, and the caretaker had mislaid her address. He went back to Devon Street. Katherine and Ted were in despair. Vincent alone was equal to the emergency. His mind was on the alert, it had grasped all the necessary details. He gave them Dean Craven's address, and told Ted to wire to Oxford for Audrey's. That was how Audrey never got the telegram till 1 o'clock. That morning the doctor pronounced Vincent decidedly better. The change, he said, was something miraculous. He took Katherine out of the room to tell her so. "Keep him quiet, and he may pull through yet. I don't say he will, but he may. Only he mustn't have any excitement." "He's had a great deal this morning. If it lasts all day, and if he has any more of it to night, will it hurt him? It's pleasant excitement, you know." The doctor looked keenly at her. To judge by her white face, she was not sharing in the pleasant excitement. "Well, I can't say. Pleasure does less harm than pain sometimes. Don't let him have any suspense, though. Suspense will kill him." But suspense was what he had to bear. Katherine knew that he was living on in the hope of Audrey's coming. Well, she would be with him by 9 at the latest, as she had said. At 8:30 Vincent began to listen for every bell. At 9 he asked to have the door set ajar, that he might hear the wheels of her cab in the street. But though many cabs went by, none stopped. "She's missed her train. We didn't give her much time. Look out the next, Kathy." Katherine looked it out. "She'll be here by 11 if she catches the 3 o'clock. It gets to Paddington at 10." Vincent closed his eyes and waited patiently till 10. Then he became excited again, the nervous tension increasing with every quarter of an hour. By 11 the street was still, and Vincent strained his ears for every sound, but no sounds were to be heard. It was 11:30. A look of fear had come over his face. Katherine could bear it no longer. She went into the next room where Ted was standing at the window. She laid her hands on his shoulder, clinging to him. "Oh, Ted, Ted," she whispered fiercely, "she'll kill him. He'll die if she doesn't come, and she isn't coming." Ted had never known his sister do that before. It was horrible, like seeing a man cry. He put his arms round her, he had almost to hold her up, and comforted her as best he could. But she put him from her gently and went back to her post. "She'll come to morrow, Vincent," she said. No. If she were coming she would have wired. But that was just what Audrey had forgotten to do. By the time she had reached Barnstaple she was too much taken up with her own tragic importance to think of any small detail of the kind. Vincent had turned over on his side. He had no more hope, and nothing mattered now. He had done his best, but was not going to carry on a trivial dispute with death. But though his spirit had given up the struggle, his body still fought on with its own blind will, a long weary fight that seemed as if it would never end. Towards morning he became to all appearance unconscious. At 7 o'clock the front door bell rang. There was a stir in the hall, and the sound of Mrs. Rogers' voice whispering. Then the door opened and closed softly. Audrey was standing there, a strange figure in the dim white room, wrapped in her bearskins, and glowing with life in the fresh morning air. At first she could distinguish nothing in the shaded light. Then she made out Ted, sitting with his back to her at the foot of the bed, and Katherine standing at the head of it. But when she saw the motionless figure raised by pillows, and vaguely defined under the disordered bedclothes, a terror seized her, and she hid her face in her hands. "Come here, Audrey," said Katherine gently. And she came, gliding, trembling, as she had come to him that afternoon at Chelsea a year and a half ago. But she kept her eyes fixed on Katherine. She was afraid to look there. "Take his hand. Speak to him." Audrey looked round, but Ted had left the room. Her small white hand slid out of her muff, warm with the warm fur, and rested on Vincent's hand, but no words came. She was sick with fear. The touch was enough. Warm and caressing, the little fingers curled into the hollow of his hand, and Vincent woke from his stupor. He opened his eyes, but their look was vague and wondering. He was not conscious yet. Katherine moved aside and drew up the blind, and the faint daylight fell on Audrey's face, as her eyes still followed Katherine. For one instant his brain seemed to fill suddenly with light. It streamed from his brain into the room, and he saw her standing in the midst of it. "Audrey!" The loud, hoarse voice startled Katherine, and made Audrey shake with fright. His hand closed tightly on hers, and he sank back into unconsciousness. For 2 hours the two women kept watch together by his bed, Katherine at the head, holding Vincent in her strong arms, Audrey sitting at the foot with her back turned to him, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. At 9 o'clock she shivered and looked round as Vincent's head sank forward on his breast. Katherine, standing at the back of the bed, first saw what had happened by the change on Audrey's face. The corners of her mouth had suddenly straightened, and she started up, white and rigid. "He's dead! Take me away, Katherine, take me away!" But this time Katherine neither saw nor heard her. "No, he was bound to die. What else could you expect after the life he led, poor fellow?" It was all over. Audrey had dragged herself out of the room, she scarcely knew how, dragged herself up to Katherine's room, and thrown herself on the bed in a passion of weeping. And Katherine, kneeling for the second time by Vincent's side, could hear the verdict of science through the half open door. Dr. Crashaw was talking to Ted. Neither Audrey nor Katherine knew how they got through the next 3 days. Audrey was afraid to sleep alone, and Katherine had her with her night and day. Audrey would have gone back to Chelsea but for her fear, and for a feeling that to leave Devon Street would be a miserable abandonment of a great situation. All those 3 days Katherine was tender to her for Vincent's sake. Happily for her, Audrey disliked going into his room. She was afraid of the long figure under the straight white sheet. Katherine could keep her watch with him again alone. She had no rival there. Once indeed they stood by his bed together, when Katherine drew back the sheet from his face, and Audrey laid above his heart a wreath of eucharis lilies, the symbol of purity. They stood beside him, the woman who loved him and the woman he had loved, and they envied him, one the peace, the other the glory of death. End of chapter 24. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Chapter 25 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 25. It was early one morning, about a week after the funeral. Hardy had gone to his grave, followed last by his friends, and first by his next of kin, Audrey, and the man who had Lavernac. Audrey was still, as she always had been, his affectionate cousin. The fact was expressly stated on the visiting card attached to the flowers wherewith she had covered his coffin. It was in Katherine's bedroom. Katherine was still in bed, waiting for Audrey to be dressed before her. Audrey was sitting at the dressing table, brushing her hair, twisting it into the big coil that shone like copper on the surface, with a dull dark red at the heart of it. She had on Katherine's white dressing gown and Katherine's slippers. She had laughed when she put them on, they were so ridiculously large for her tiny feet. Audrey was rebounding after the pressure that had been put on her during the last 10 days. The weight was lifted now. After all, she had not felt herself an important actor in that drama of death. Death himself had come and waved her coldly aside. She had been nothing in that household filled with his presence. Here again she had been overpowered by one of those unseen, incomprehensible things that she could not grasp, but that crushed her and made her of no account. At times, in her misery, she had even felt a vague, faint jealousy of the dead; but since the day of the funeral her supple nature had unbent. She could talk now, and she talked incessantly, generally about Vincent. She had begun by monopolising his memory.
making it a sacred possession of her own, till not even that consolation was left to Katherine. Audrey stood between her and every scene connected in her mind with Vincent. The figure of Audrey seemed to draw nearer and grow larger, until it covered everything else. Her stream of talk was blotting out the impressions that Katherine most longed to keep, giving to the past a transient character of its own. She was killing remembrance, and there came upon Katherine a fear of the forgetfulness where all things end. And now, as she lay there watching Audrey, she recalled the truth that she had lost sight of since Vincent's death, the truth that he had told her. He would have loved her if it had not been for Audrey. She had begun to realize the intensity of the duel which had been between Audrey and her from the first. It had begun in the days when Audrey had stood in the way of Ted's career. It had gone on afterwards, when it was to be feared that she had done him still more grievous harm. And it had ended in separating Katherine from Vincent and even from his memory. Rather, that duel had neither beginning nor end. There was something foregone and inevitable about it, something that had its roots deep down in their opposite natures. It had to be. It had been from the hour when she first met Audrey until now, when the two women were again thrown together in a detestable mockery of friendship, forced into each other's arms, lying by each other's side. Audrey had been quiet for some time, and Katherine was nervously wondering when she would begin. "Katherine," she said at last, "I want you to come back with me to Chelsea to day." The fact was, Miss Craven was in Devonshire, and Audrey was still afraid to be in the house by herself. "I couldn't, possibly. I can't leave Ted." "That doesn't matter. Ted can come too." What was Audrey's mind like? Had it no memory? "I think not, Audrey." Audrey said no more. She gave the last touches to her hair, put on her black dress, and turned herself slowly round before the looking glass. She was satisfied with the result. It was her last day in Devon Street, so the Havilands had to be nice to her. Ted went out soon after breakfast. He was incapable of any sustained effort. Audrey did not know it, but the boy hated the house now that she was in it. Katherine had dreaded being left alone with her that morning. She knew that last words would come, and they came. They were sitting together by the studio fire, talking about indifferent subjects, when suddenly Audrey left her seat and knelt down by Katherine's knees in an attitude of confession. "Katherine," she began, and her grey eyes filled with tears, "before I go I want to tell you something." "What is it?" "I want you to know that I really loved Vincent all the time." She waited to see the effect of her words, but Katherine set her teeth firmly and said nothing. Audrey went on, still kneeling. "I don't know what made me get engaged to Ted. I liked him, you know, dear boy, but I think it was because Vincent would not understand me, and he wanted to hurry things so. And you see, I didn't know then how much I loved him. Then afterwards " She stopped. She had come to the difficult part of her confession. "Well?" Then, you see, I knew Mr. Wyndham, and he " Another pause. "What did Mr. Wyndham do?" It was better that she should talk about Mr. Wyndham than about Vincent. "I don't know what he did, but he made me mad. He made me think I cared for him. He was so clever. You know, I always adored clever people. And, well, nobody could call poor Vincent clever, could they?" In spite of herself, Katherine's lip curled with scorn. But Audrey was too much absorbed in her confession to see it. "I suppose that fascinated me. Then afterwards, when Vincent took to those dreadful ways, whatever my feelings were, you know, Katherine, it was impossible." Katherine could bear it no longer, but she managed to control her voice in answering, "Why do you tell me these things? Do you suppose I care to hear about your feelings? If you do feel " "If I do feel? Kathy!" "Well, why can't you keep quiet now it's too late?" "Because I wanted you to know that I loved him." There was silence. Presently Audrey put one hand on Katherine's knee. "Kathy " "I'd rather you didn't call me that, if you don't mind." "Why?" Audrey stared with large, incomprehensive eyes. "I can't tell you why." "Katherine, then. It is prettier. Do you know, I sometimes think it's better, oh, infinitely better, that he should have died." Katherine rose from her seat to end it, looking down on the kneeling figure as she answered bitterly, "It was indeed infinitely better." But irony, like so many other things of the kind, was beyond Audrey. "I suppose I ought to go now," she said, rising. Katherine made no answer. Audrey went away to get ready, a little reluctantly, for she had so much more to say. It had never occurred to her to be jealous of Katherine. That may have been either because she did not know or because she did not care. She had been so sure of Vincent. Presently she came back with her hat on. She carried her bearskins in her hand, and under the shade of the broad black beaver her face wore an expression of anxious thought. "Katherine." She held out her cape and muff, and Katherine remembered that they were those which Vincent had given her. "I suppose I can wear my furs still, even if I am in mourning?" There was neither scorn nor irony in the look that Katherine turned on her, and Audrey understood this time. As plainly as looks can speak, it condemned her as altogether lighter than vanity itself, and while condemning, it forgave her. "He gave them to me, you know," she said at last. Audrey's pathos generally came too late. She drove away wrapped in her furs, and for once unconscious of her own beauty, so dissatisfied was she with the part she had played in the great tragedy. Somehow her parts seemed always to dwindle this way in retrospect. That afternoon a parcel arrived, addressed to Hardy by his publishers. Katherine opened it. It contained early copies of the Pioneer book, the book that after all Vincent was never to see. She saw with a pang her own design, blazing in gold on the cover, and her frontispiece sketch of the author. Then she turned to the dedication page and read: "To her who has inspired all that there may be of good in it, this book is dedicated by her affectionate cousin, Vincent Hardy." It was an epitaph. End of chapter 25. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 26 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 26. One day's work among the poor of St. Teresa's, Lambeth, is enough to exhaust you if you are at all sensitive and highly strung, and Audrey had had 3 days of it. No wonder, then, that as she leaned back in a particularly hard wooden chair in the Vicar's study, every nerve in her body was on edge. It was a year after Vincent's death. With lapse of time that event had lost much of its oppressive magnificence, and it affected Audrey more in looking back than it had done in reality. Time, too, had thrown her relations with Wyndham into relief, and as she realized more and more their true nature, the conscience that had been so long quiescent began to stir in her. Its voice seemed to be seconding Wyndham's and Katherine's verdict. She became uneasy about herself. Once more, this time in serious sincerity, she felt the need of a stronger personality upholding and pervading her own. Absolute dependence on somebody else's character had become a habit of her nature. She could no more live now without some burning stimulus to thought and feeling than the drunkard can satisfy his thirst with plain water. Naturally she thought of Mr. Flaxman Reed, as Katherine had thought of him the midnight before Vincent's death, or as she had thought of him herself in the day of her temptation. This time she had ended by going to him, as many a woman had gone before, with her empty life in her hands, begging that it might be filled. For all cases of the kind, Mr. Flaxman Reed had one remedy, work in the parish of St. Teresa's. As a rule it either killed or cured them. But he had spared Audrey hitherto, as he would have spared some sick child a medicine too strong and bitter for it. Finally, much to his surprise, she asked him for the work of her own accord, and he gave it to her. And now she had had 3 days of it. It was enough. It made her head ache yet to think of all she had gone through. For the first 2 days she had been sustained by a new and wholly delightful sensation, the consciousness of her own goodness. On the third day that support had suddenly given way. A woman's coarse word, the way a man had looked at her as she lifted her silk petticoats out of the mud, some bit of crude criticism, such as Demos publishes at street corners in the expressive vernacular, had been sufficient to destroy all the bright illusions that gilded the gutters of Lambeth, reflections of a day that was not hers. And yet she had come into a new world with new ideas and new emotions. If not the best of all possible worlds, it was better than any which had once seemed probable, and she wanted to stay in it. She was dazzled by the splendour of religion. The curtain had risen on the great miracle play of the soul. She, too, longed to dance in the masque of the virtues and the graces. Every fresh phase of life had presented itself to Audrey in spectacular magnificence. She could not help seeing things so, it was the way her mind worked. The candles burning on the high altar of St. Teresa's were only footlights in the wrong place, and the veil that Mr. Flaxman Reed had lifted a little for her was the curtain going up before another stage. Meanwhile she had to consider his possible criticism of her own acting. Sitting in the hard ascetic chair, she looked round the room and tried to understand a little of its owner's life. Every detail in it was a challenge to her intelligence. She perplexed herself with questions. Why didn't Mr. Flaxman Reed have a proper carpet on the floor? Why didn't he hang a curtain over that ugly green baize door? It led into the room where he held his classes and entertained his poorer parishioners. That room was also his dining room. How could he eat his meals after all those dreadful people had been in it, poor things? Why only common deal bookcases, a varnished desk, and that little painted table underneath the big crucifix? Why these painfully uneasy chairs, and yes, only one picture, and that of the most emaciated of Madonnas? Could not her old favourite Botticelli have supplied him with a lovelier type? Or there was Raphael. Sometimes, on a Sunday evening after service, she had come in here from the rich, warm, scented church, with the music of an august liturgy ringing in her ears, and the chill place had struck like death to all her senses. And this was the atmosphere in which his life was spent, this, and the gaunt streets and the terrible slums of Lambeth. She was not left long alone, for Mr. Flaxman Reed never kept any one waiting if he could help it. As he seated himself opposite to her, the set lines of his face relaxed and his manner softened. Her eyes followed the outline of his face, which stood out white and sharp against the dark window curtain. She noted the crossed legs, the hands folded on his knees, the weary pose of the whole wasted figure. It ought to have been an appeal to her pity. The poor man was suffering from many kinds of hunger and from intense exhaustion. He had just dismissed a tiresome parishioner, and, vexed with himself for having kept Audrey waiting, had left his dinner in the next room untouched, and came all unnerved to this interview which he dreaded yet desired. He listened quietly to the story of her failure. It was not only what he had expected, but what he had wished. "It's no good my trying any more," she urged, in the pleading voice that she could make so sweet. "I can't do anything. The sight of those poor wretches' misery only makes me miserable too. I dream of it at night. I assure you it's been the most awful 3 days I ever spent in my life." "Has it?" "Yes. I feel things so terribly, you know, and it's not as if I could do anything. I simply can't. What must you think of me?" "I think nothing. I knew that you would tell me this, and I am glad." "Are you? Glad that I failed?" "Yes, glad and thankful." He paused. His thin sensitive lips trembled, and when he spoke again it was in a low constrained voice, as if he were struggling with some powerful feeling. "I wanted you to learn by failure that it is not what we know nor what we do, but what we are that matters in the sight of God." "Yes, I know that." She sat looking up with her head a little on one side, holding her chin in one hand. It had been her attitude in her student days at Oxford, when trying to follow a difficult lecture, and she reverted to it now. For Mr. Flaxman Reed was very difficult. His style fascinated and yet repelled her, and in this case the style was the man. "What am I?" said Audrey presently. It was a curious question, and none of her friends had answered it to her satisfaction. She was eager to know Mr. Reed's opinion. He turned and looked at her, and his eyes were two clear lights under the shadow of the sharp eye bone. "What are you? With all your faults and all your failures, you are something infinitely more valuable than you know." "What makes you say so?" "I say so because I think that God cares more for those that hunger and thirst after righteousness than for those who are filled at His table. Believe me, nothing in all our intercourse has touched me so much as this confession of your failure." "Has it really? Can you trust me again in spite of it?" "Yes. You have trusted me. I take it as one of the greatest pleasures, the greatest privileges of my life, that you should have come to me as you have done, not when you were bright and happy, but in your weakness and distress, in what I imagine to have been the darkest hour of all, when refuge failed you and no man cared for your soul." "No, that's the worst of it, that there's nobody to turn to, nobody cares. If I thought that you cared, but " "Indeed I care." "For my soul, yes." Her "yes" was a deep sigh. "Why not? It is my office. A priest is answerable to God for the souls of his people." He spoke with a touch of austerity in his tone. Something warned him that if this conversation was to be profitable to either of them, he must avoid personalities. His position in the church was a compromise. His attitude towards Audrey Craven was only another kind of compromise, so much concession to her weakness, so much to her appealing womanhood. He had begun by believing in her soul. That was the plea he made to the fierce exacting conscience, always requiring a spiritual motive for his simplest actions. And he had ended by creating the thing he believed in, and in his own language he was answerable to God for it. But hitherto with his own nature he had made no compromise. He had sacrificed heart, senses, and intellect to the tyranny of his conscience. He had ceased to dread their insane revolt against that benevolent despotism. And now the question that tormented him was whether all the time he had not been temporising with his own inexorable humanity, whether his relations with Audrey Craven did not involve a perpetual intrigue between the earthly and the heavenly. For there was a strange discrepancy between his simple heart, that took all things seriously, even a frivolous woman, and the tortuous and tangled thing that was his conscience. He went on at first in the same self controlled voice, monotonous but for a peculiar throbbing stress on some words, and he seemed to be speaking more to himself than her. "You say you can do nothing, and I believe it. What of that? The things that are seen are temporal, the things that are unseen are eternal. Our deeds are of the things that are seen. They are part of the visible, finite world, done with our hands, with our body. They belong to the flesh that profiteth nothing. It is only the spirit, only the pure and holy will that gives them life. That will is not ours, not yours or mine. Before we can receive it, our will must die. Otherwise there would be two wills in us struggling for possession. You have come to me for help. After all, I can give you none. I can only tell you what I know, that there is no way of peace but the way of renunciation. I can only say, if your will is not yet one with God's will, renounce it. Give it up. Then and then only you will live, not before. Look there!" He pointed to the crucifix. "The great pagan religions had each their symbol of life. For us who are Christ's, the symbol of life is the crucifix. Crucify self. When you have done that, you will have no need to come and ask me what you must do and what you must leave undone. Your deeds are they must be pure." His excitement moved her, her eyes filled with tears, but she followed his words slowly and painfully. He was always making these speeches to her, full of the things she could not understand. How often she had felt this sense of effort and pain in the old art days with Ted, or when she had been held helpless in the grasp of Wyndham's relentless intellect. She had chafed when the barriers rose between her mind and theirs, but between her and this 19th century ascetic there was an immeasurable gulf fixed. She could not reach the hand he stretched out to her across it. Even his living presence seemed endlessly far from hers, and the thought of that separation filled her with a deep resigned humility. Now, though his thoughts were poured into her consciousness without mixing with it, cloudy, insoluble, troubling its blank transparency, something in the rhythmic movement of his words stirred her, so responsive was she to every impression of sense. They recalled to her that other gospel of life preached to her by Langley, and though she understood imperfectly, she felt the difference with shame. The young priest went on, still as if speaking to himself. "There are only two things we have to learn, the knowledge of self and the knowledge of God, and they hang together. If there is any sin in us, unconfessed and unrecognised as sin, there is no knowledge of God and no union with Him possible for us." She rose, moved a step forward, and then stood looking at him irresolutely. Truly a revelation was there for her, but she was in that state of excitement in which we are more capable of making revelations than of receiving them. He had risen too, and was holding out his hand. "Well," he said more gently, "there is something you want to say to me. Please sit down again." She shook her head and still stood upright. Possessed with the thought of the confession she was about to make, she felt that she needed all the dignity that attitude afforded. At last she spoke, very low and quickly, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. "You say you know me, but you don't. You don't know what I am, what I am capable of. But I must tell you. The thought of it is stifling me. Once, only 2 years ago, I had a terrible temptation. It came to me through some one whom I loved very dearly. I was ready to give up everything everything, you understand, for him. And I would have done it, only God was good to me. He made it impossible for me, and I was saved. But I am just as bad, just as guilty, as if he had let it happen." It was done. The unutterable thing was said. For once Audrey had been absolutely truthful and sincere. The soul that he had evoked had come forth as it were new born out of the darkness. At first neither of them spoke. Then he sat down and thanked her, simply, for what she had just told him. But to his own shame and grief he had nothing more to say. He had heard many a confession, and from many a guiltier woman's lips, but none so piteous, because none so purely spontaneous as this. And to all he had given pity, counsel, and help. But now he was dumb. She was thirsting for help that she could understand. She clasped her hands imploringly and looked into his face, but it had no pity for her and no deliverance. She could see nothing there but grief, grief terrible and profound. "I see. Then you too judge me like the rest." "God forbid. I judge no man." Which was true, for it was the woman he had judged. She looked at him again, a long look full of wonder and reproach, then she went quietly away. She had reached the end of the narrow passage leading from the study to the front hall, when she recollected that she had left behind her a small manual of devotion. He had given it to her not long ago. She went back for it and knocked softly at the study door. There was no answer, and supposing that he had gone through into the room beyond, she opened the door and looked in. He was kneeling in the far corner of the study, with his hands stretched out before the crucifix. From the threshold where she stood she could see the agony of his uplifted face and hear his prayer: "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" Audrey knew then that for one moment the love she had hungered and thirsted after more than after righteousness had been actually within her grasp, and that she had lost it. The shadow of an uncommitted sin stood between her and the one man by whom and for whom she could have grown pure and womanly and good. For Flaxman Reed had loved her, though up to that evening he had been in complete ignorance of the fact, being already wedded to what the world considers an impossible ideal. Such is the power of suggestion, that Audrey's confession of her weakness had revealed to him his own. If she had been all that he believed her to be, he might not have regarded his feeling for her as in itself of the nature of sin. But his sensitive soul, made morbid by its self imposed asceticism, recoiled from the very thought of impurity in the woman he loved. Hence his powerlessness to help her. He knew, none better, that a stronger man would not have felt this difficulty. He had trembled before his own intellect, now he was afraid of his own heart. Audrey, it was for such that his Christ had died, and he could not even speak a word to save her. He became almost blasphemous in his agony. Christ had died on his cross. He, Christ's servant, had crucified self, and it could not die. Was this the ironic destiny of all ideals too austere for earth, too divine for humanity? Not long afterwards Flaxman Reed was received into the communion of the Church of Rome. He had done with compromise. End of chapter 26. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 27 of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 27. It was Audrey's fate to be condemned by those whom she had most cared for. Ted and Vincent, Langley and Katherine, and lastly Mr. Flaxman Reed, they had all judged her, harshly, imperfectly, as human nature judges. Of the five, perhaps Vincent, because he was a child of nature, and Katherine, because she was a good woman, alone appreciated the more pathetic of Audrey's effects. She presented the moving spectacle of a small creature struggling with things too great for her. Love, art, nature, religion, she had never really given herself up to any one of them. But she had called upon them all in turn, and instead of sustaining, they had overwhelmed her. And it seemed that Mr. Flaxman Reed, as the minister of the religion in which she had sought shelter for a day, had failed her the most unexpectedly and in her direst necessity. And yet he had done more for her than any of the others. She had lied to all of them; he had made it possible for her to be true. Flaxman Reed would certainly not have called himself a psychological realist, But by reason of his one strength, his habit of constant communion with the unseen, he had solved Langley Wyndham's problem. It would never have occurred to the great novelist, in his search for the real Audrey, to look deeper than the primitive passions, or to suspect that the secret of personality could lie in so pure a piece of mechanism as the human conscience. Soon after her confession Audrey left town for the neighbourhood of Oxford. She may have perceived that London was too vast a stage for her slender performances, or she may have had some idea of following up a line slanting gently between the two paths pointed out to her by Langley Wyndham and Flaxman Reed, who had been the strongest forces in her life. She had come to herself, but she was not the stuff of which renunciants are made. It was about 3 years later that Mr. Langley Wyndham, looking over his Times one morning, had the joy of reading the announcement of Miss Audrey Craven's marriage with Algernon Jackson, Esquire, of Broughton Poggs, in the county of Oxfordshire. It was true. After all, Audrey had married a nonentity. It was the end of her long quest of the eminent and superlative. Mr. Jackson was certainly not an eminent person, and he was superlative only in so far as he passed for the biggest bore in the county. But he had the positive merit of being a gentleman, which in these days of a talented democracy amounts almost to genius. Since that night when, as a guileless undergraduate, he had interfered with Audrey's first introduction to Langley Wyndham, Mr. Jackson's career had been simplicity itself. He had tried most of the learned professions and failed in all he tried. He then took up model goose farming on a large scale, and achieved success amidst the jeers of his family and friends. The echo of that derision was soon lost in the jingle of Algernon's guineas. Not every one can attain a golden mediocrity, and it was a great step for a man who had hitherto ranked as a nonentity. On the strength of it he asked the beautiful Miss Craven to be his wife, and no one was more surprised than himself when she consented. She was his first and last love of a series of loves. For Mr. Jackson had never read Laura, indeed he read but few books, and if you had told him of Langley Wyndham's masterpiece to day, he would have forgotten all about it by to morrow. He would certainly never have thought of identifying its heroine with his wife. Nobody ever understood why Audrey made that marriage. For any one who had enjoyed the friendship of such men as Langley Wyndham and Flaxman Reed, there was bathos in the step. It seemed an ugly concession to actuality. It may have been. For Audrey was nothing if not modern, the daughter of an age that has flirted with half a dozen ideals, all equally fascinating, and finally decided in favour of a mature realism. She may have learned that hardest lesson of the schools, the translation of life's drama from fancy into fact; found out that all the time the grey old chorus has been singing not of love and joy, as she once in her ignorance imagined, but of unspeakable rest on the great consoling platitudes of life, where there is no more revelation because there is no mystery, and no despair because there is no hope. The text of that chorus is often corrupt, but the meaning is never hopelessly obscure. In other words, she may have married Mr. Jackson in a fit of pessimism. Or perhaps she had profited by the more cheerful though equally important lesson of the playground; learned that whether the game of life be fast or slow, dull or amusing, matters little when you are knocked out in the first round. She herself had had many rounds, not counting Mr. Jackson. That in these circumstances one may still find considerable entertainment in looking on, and that in any case the player is not for the game, but the game for the player. The player, who may be left on the ground long after all games have been played out. But this is to suppose that Audrey was a philosopher, which is manifestly absurd. Perhaps, more likely than not, her revelation came when she was least looking for it, stumbling by the merest accident on one of the great things of life, the eternal, the incomprehensible, for of these some say that the greatest is love. It is certainly the most incomprehensible. She may have loved Mr. Jackson. If she did not, she has never let him know it. End of chapter 27. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. End of Audrey Craven by May Sinclair.